Hello, hello.
And hello to you all. For those of you wondering why we might be late, I'm going to put my hand up and say it's 100% my fault. I had food poisoning yesterday, which was, as I'm sure you can imagine, an entirely horrible affair. It also is not 100% out of my system, as I found out approximately 5 minutes ago. So if I have to run off through the course of this stream, you know why. Just try not to think about what's happening.
Yeah, so clearly some other hobgoblins spiked your food, as they do, the treacherous little bastards.
Fucking little hobgoblins. So hello to everybody out there. An absolute delight to be with you all, and not in the other room back there where the door is still open, having a sojourn in the toilet.
Hey, you know what? It happens to all of us. Happens to all of us.
Yeah, man.
Good to be back. Yeah, we took, for those unaware, we did take last week off because I was down at the Renaissance Festival, which was a super good time.
Oh, excellent.
I spent way too much money. I got lots of cool stuff. I found a sword that looks exactly like Tehenwin's blade from one of those little curved crisp blades. So I picked that up, and it was on a super big discount. So I was like, the universe wanted me to have this, clearly.
Definitely.
But yeah, picked up a lot of cool stuff. I got the full-sized Mace of Sauron that I have to figure out how to hang on a wall because it's gigantic.
Nice.
It's way too big. I felt like an idiot buying it because I got to the car and tried to put it in the trunk and went, uh-oh, this does not fit in the trunk. So I got to carry the box in my lap the entire way home, which was a 3.5-hour drive. So,
well, I hope you had a lot of fun with that. On my side, I just played Dragon Age because I figured new game out, let's give it a go. That's what I did last Sunday. I've completed it now and I enjoyed it immensely.
That's good.
Good times, HUD by all. I've just picked up Persona 3 because I never got around to playing the upgraded version because it was on cheap this week. So I figured I'd complete that too. I played it a bajillion years ago on PSP of all machines. And yeah, picked it up on a PS5 and I've been kicking around in that and having an absolute whale of a time. What an upgrade. For those of you who are Persona fans, the Persona 3 upgrade is astonishingly good. A little bit sad that you don't get a female protagonist as well, much like you did back in the PSP, but I'll live with it. So anyway, yes, super delighted to be here. Are we all good to go?
Yeah, I think we are all set to chat about some hobgoblins, which this will be interesting. I'm curious how this is going to go.
I'm going to bring up some controversial theories in this one as well. Before we go, the same old things that we're going to start with. Number one, obviously, there's going to be all kinds of interesting chat that you might bring to bear. Super chat in particular. Given the nature of hobgoblins, you may have some questions about them that we might not cover. That's what super chats are for. Bring them in. Share them with us. We'll be taking them with batches as we go. We've already got a few in, as far as I can tell. They all arrived well before I arrived. So we'll pick those up first. Be aware we'll be taking them in batches as we go. So what do we have first?
Sure. Yeah, we can knock these out real quick. Darius, what would you say is the largest greenskin nation in the world? Is in a collection of greenskins. Also, how large do some of the WAs get in terms of numbers?
Okay, so this is fascinating as a question.
Yeah, that's actually a way more interesting and deep question than you may have realized. And hobgoblins are actually kind of the perfect group to talk about because so greenskin nations is a really difficult. Yeah, it's a tricky term for them because of the way a lot of them operate and the way that, you know, they're so aggressive and other races are so aggressive towards them that they tend not to have anything close to reliable borders. And the closest thing we often see to like stagnant nations are below the ground. So even then it's hard to say anything for sure. I mean, if you look on maps, they're never given borders. There's just like a little symbol that'll be like, there's a tribe here, and there's a tribe over here, and there's a tribe over here. What's interesting is that and we'll talk about this with the hobgoblins, they are often kind of considered to have the largest quote unquote nation being the Khanate, but even then it's a nomadic nation. So they don't have settlements. They just roam. Which is probably why they're able to control, even though they're not really, such a large amount of space. Kind of like how, you know, when we talked about the Chaos Dwarfs, we're like, oh, here's like the Chaos Dwarf borders, but in reality, their empire is a lot tinier than that. That's kind of how greenskins are as
Islands.
well.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree. The concept of a nation doesn't really apply to greenskins as we understand it. First, the word nation doesn't really apply to anything in the old world anyway. If you take a look up at what nation means, it'd be more like a realm, an area underneath the control of individuals. And Hobgoblin, as we will go on to describe ad nauseum very soon, is certainly on paper in control of by far the largest area that any single greenskin can claim in the world. By far. But Hobgoblin very much controls a patchwork of different tribes, all of which have their own warlords, all of which, to a degree, pay lip service to Hobgoblin. But when push comes to shove, he is supposedly capable of pulling pretty much all of those tribes together underneath his rule. And if he were to do so, it wouldn't just be as big or perhaps bigger than any of the Great Waz. It would also be calculating, cunning, and well organized in a way that few others expect or realize. There's a reason the Great Wall exists, and it's not just simply to keep chaos out for all chaos big bad guy that they often discuss. It's because of the hobgoblins. And when the hobgoblins get organized, there is little that can stand against them in a very different way to a Wa. Because as far as we can tell, at least up to this point, hobgoblins don't Wa. Hobgoblins get their shit together. And when that happens, it's not good. So to cut a long story short on this one here, is it the biggest one? Nominally, yes, but I would argue that some of the longer standing, even that doesn't make sense. I would argue that some of the great orc realms that sit in the World's Edge Mountains and around down there are arguably bigger in terms of numbers that all pay lip service to an individual, and that individual actually rules them. But in terms of overall scale and true numbers, the hobgoblins wipe the floor with them. And what large do they get in how large do Waz get? That's a different stream really about Waz. Let's just say for the moment, without doing the Waz stream, that they get really fucking big.
Yeah, you're easily going 6 digits at least.
Yeah. And in many of the Waz, the top end Waz 7 digits easy. Plus. They've got to be able to take out entire realms like the Empire, and the Empire has millions of humans living in it by itself. So yeah, it's big.
Yep. Cole Patterson, in D&D, the 3 major goblinoids are goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears. Have bugbears ever been in Warhammer? Do you think a version of them could fit? So, to my knowledge, there's never been specifically bugbears. There were half-orcs, which were a thing.
Were.
And GW vaguely mentioned bringing them back for the old world, and yet they haven't appeared yet, so I don't know what the situation is there. But I don't believe we've seen bugbears, but I would categorize under that if someone were like, if GW went, hey, there are bugbears, I would go, oh, of course there are. But to this day, I haven't seen any. Would probably be the safest way to answer that.
Yeah, bugbears as goblinoids are very much a D&D thing, and there they've stayed. The original Warhammer, which I'm going to get into when we go into our description, picked up the core fantasy species as was produced by Citadel Miniatures, and the most popular ones beyond that. And bugbears certainly were not a core component of that. Thus, they never got ported into the initial version of Warhammer. Because of that, as Warhammer then developed into its own thing and became less reliant on taking stuff from other people, they weren't taking bugbears because they never did to begin with. So the answer to this one is no, they have their own species of greenskins. But I'm also, as part of not necessarily my intro, but certainly during the course of this, going to be discussing what the hell is a greenskin anyway, because there's certainly a question to be answered there. Yeah.
Curious. Do orcs have begrudging respect for hobgoblins in terms of martial prowess, since a goblin is already pretty terrifying, basically being a baboon or a chimp on crack that is smart enough to use proper weapons? No. Orcs.
No.
Hard orcs, no. No. Orcs. Begrudging respect is something that an orc might have for like a very hardy dwarf. Anything with the word goblin in it, absolutely not.
So hobgoblins are the worst of the fucking worst as far as other greenskins are concerned, and this includes goblins. They are treacherous, sniveling, sneaky, backstabbing bastards who do not deserve their time at all. Doesn't matter how good one may or may not be in combat. The only skills they likely have is stabbing you in the back when you're not looking. No hobgoblin is ever worthy of respect, even if it's Hobgoblin can. And why that is the case, I think, is something that is worth diving into, because I'm going to be bringing up in my intro the core reason that Games Workshop give, but I'm also going to say in my intro that not only is it unsatisfying, is exceedingly unlikely, meaning that there must be a bigger story. And I'll give one example of how that bigger story could be reimagined. But that's in the intro.
I fully concur with that. And I think I know where you're going to go with it, but I'll see if I'm right or not. Warzag's Quirky Mischief. What did Warzag and the other orc shamans think of the Feaster from Beyond? Do they think he's a right scary git, or do they want to smash the forest gobos for such heresy? So that is a fun question. One of the things we talked, I think, a little bit about this during the Spider God stream is that Greenskins actually have more gods than a lot of people think they do. Of that, when you get into the night goblins, you have stuff about like the Bad Moon, and then when you talk about like the goblins that roam the plains and the orcs that roam the Badlands, they have the evil sun, and they have these other deific type entities, and it seems that it's generally well enough accepted, but they're just kind of beneath Gork and Mork. And it's probably how Warzag typically would view it. I don't think Warzag. It's funny to imagine him being bothered by something big like heresy, but I think for Warzag, it would be more a situation of that he would believe that he speaks with the voice of the gods, and if someone disagrees with him, then he's going to zap them or punch them or do whatever it is that he does. But I don't think he would go so far as to consider it a heresy. I think that's kind of a level higher than he would bother to think about it.
Yeah, gods are gods, and Mork and Gork's the best of them. There's only really one thing that properly creeps the greenskins out, particularly orcs, and that's chaos. Orcs are properly and rightly kind of afraid of chaos. It just gives them the fucking creeps. Where something like, rather amusingly for giving them the creeps, something like the Great Feaster from Beyond, whilst yes, it's well within that category, not really. It's goblin business, isn't it? They don't really think about it. You shouldn't think of them as great, deep thinkers, as great intellectualists who are sitting there wondering about what goes on the other side of the camp. They just don't. They're much like animals in some regards, in that they deal with what's directly in front of them. They don't have much in the way of reflection. They're not thinking about what's happening tomorrow, the next day. They're not thinking about the consequences for their actions. What they're doing is dealing with what's directly in front of them at that moment, in that period of time. They live in the moment. That's a good way of trying to get out of the human mindset to a more orky mindset. And in that, they're not sitting there reflecting on the Great Feaster from Beyond, unless it's directly against them. And then it's simply, how do I hit it? And the broad answer here is no, not really. They're something that for the deeper thinking orcs may come up as a, yes, that's a thing, but even then, no, not really, because they are at heart an ally, and in their brains, less than Mork and Gork, so there's not really anything to be afraid of. And is it a smoosh the forest goblins for such heresy? Yeah, nah, it's just smoosh the forest goblins if they don't do what they're told. And if they don't, well, let's hit them. And then they charge them, and they either run away or they don't, and they don't really think that much about it.
Yeah, there's a moment. I want to say it's in the End Times novel by Guy Haley, where Skarsnik is literally dealing with some forest goblins, and his response when like the spider god gets brought up is he's like, yeah, those guys are a little off, but whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they just move on. So there you go. Though I will say, to Andy's thing about the thinking orc, I always laugh because I don't remember what artist made it, but there's a really funny Warhammer Fantasy piece. It's a parody of the Thinking Man statue. The statue with the guy with like thinking on his fist, and it's an orc, but of course he's doing it while taking a crap, and he's sitting on a mound of dung while doing it, which is just such a funny. It's a great. It's
picture. A funny piece. Agreed.
Julius, hi. Any plans with updating the Spotify list? It should be just about caught up. Maybe not the most recent episode, but other than that, it should be all the way caught up. But I'll double check it after this. Dylan, Andy, would you make a video / post about what your thoughts are on Dragon Age Veilguard? I'd like to see them.
I may do, actually, because apparently it's turned into a deeply controversial game, which I find exceedingly amusing for a host of reasons. And I have a lot of thoughts about the game because for all I don't agree with much of the criticisms, I do think it's a game that deserves criticism, like all games do. The things it does well and the things it doesn't do well.
That could be like a good little Patreon post or something.
Exactly. And that could be a fun little one aside. So yeah, I'll have a wee think about that one, Dylan, because I have a lot to say on the subject because I've played all the games multiple times. In fact, I've completed Veilguard twice now. So I've got a pretty strong idea of what the game's about.
There you go. Singemeister. So between the White Scars, the Ogre Kingdoms, the Hung, and the Hobgoblins, who's the most Mongol? GW really does like their took Mongol and was like, how many directions can we go from here?
I'm going to go into this because it's something that actually bugs me a bit about the use of other ethnicities, peoples, cultures, or whatever in Warhammer, and how they always single up on the same ones because they're the only ones that are known in general by the British psyche, by the overall British education system. They only focus on one or two others. And because of that, that's all that really gets reflected in Games Workshop's output, because they don't do the research into all the other potential stuff that they could draw upon. So something like the Mongols sadly gets used again and again and again, whilst there's so many other fascinating, awesome things that they could have drawn upon. But yes, between those four, you've certainly got a damn fine start. And there's more, because you also have the Ostlanders, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You also have the Horse Archers of Kislev that are, the Ungols. They're also, bloody hell, there are so many of them that are basically Mongols. This is just a start, though. I could go on for some time with it. So cut a long story short on this one. Yes, the Hobgoblins are deeply inspired by Mongols.
But hey, at least it got me to read I was reading Mongol Wikipedia page yesterday and today, so there's that. Tiblam, here's my morning offering to the cat ears headphones, Andy. We miss you. Also, do Hobgoblins have real diplomacy with other races? So there's a thing that we'll talk about it a bit, but Hobgoblins do crop up a lot in mercenary type books. And they've had some very interesting depictions, especially as Warhammer aged and kind of matured a bit. That's something we'll talk about a lot later. So I'm just going to say stay tuned to that, because I want to get through Andy's intro first, because it's going to set a really good grounding to then kind of see. One thing we've talked a lot about on these different streams is a lot of the races that don't tend to get a lot of attention as Games Workshop has gotten older, especially in the last decade to 5-ish years. They kind of started to turn their attention to a lot of these older groups and gone, maybe let's do something a little different.
Warhammery. Yeah, totally. Agreed completely. So my answer on that one is again going to be I'm going to be covering a chunk of that as we go. So yes.
Drip critic: do the Hobgoblins do the rest of the things the Mongols do? Pictures of the art, sciences, trade, etc. So what I will say here is the answer is no, to be flat. But what I will say is that they are very unique among greenskins, which we'll get to. And the thing that you would probably, and I imagine Andy will kind of mention this, is that you have to keep in mind that the Hobgoblins are not the actual Mongolians. They are the West's very, especially back,
Okay, I'm going to make it bad. They are a medieval times stereotype. A racist stereotype of Mongols. That's it. That's all they are. They're a racist stereotype, missing out all the deeper cultural aspects. And that racist stereotype got copy-pasted into the early version of Warhammer and never really got updated. So the answer to this one is no, because they're a racist stereotype. But if they're ever developed in any way or fashion at a later date, they almost certainly will take on some, not all, parts and other new things of this and more as they develop as a proper culture. But as it stands, all we have is the bare bones of what they are. But I'll be covering that also in the intro.
The easiest way I would put this is go watch Disney's Mulan and how it interprets the Hun culture, and that's basically the exact same thing.
Yeah, not wrong.
Luke Ronan, how do Hobgoblins fit in terms of strength within greenskin species as a whole? So you have orcs, Hobgoblins, goblins. They're right smack in the middle.
Yeah, and I would also argue that that's a good spread for their intelligence as well, although there is an argument that Hobgoblins are by far the most intelligent of them all, but it is an argument. I'll be picking that up in my intro as well.
Yep. Chris, some folks joined the stream with the Hobgoblin, with a Hobgoblin beer.
Brilliant. Oh, I should have done that.
Question: have the Hobgoblins ever been detailed in any Wolf Adventure story outside of the bestiary? Yes, they actually feature prominently in the new book by Cubicle 7 called Tribes and Tribulations, which the Hobgoblin section is actually pretty good. I actually like it quite a bit. And they also make a pretty hefty appearance in Tarmakon. But though the Tarmakon goes out of its way to explain that these aren't true Hobgoblins, they're Chaos Dwarf Hobgoblins, which are a different culture.
Absolutely different.
Toss Apprentice, given Hobgoblins are based on Mongol Turks, can they use gunpowder? Not rifling, but fire arrows, fire lances. Not that we've ever heard of.
Yeah, as it stands, no, but it's very much something that I think that if the Hobgoblins are ever properly developed as a canet, as the full what the Hobgoblins are, as in separate from the Chaos Dwarves, it's very likely that something like this would be added. If I was writing it, it would definitely be added. But I'm clearly not, nor
Yeah,
would I, nor will I ever be. But I do think that it's something that will potentially occur.
Yeah, the Hobgrots of Age of Sigmar do use black powder weapons. So I would not be shocked if when they develop the Khanate, they use black powder as well. Viper Wolf praise. No.
Wrong dream.
No. Thank you for thank you for the super chat, Viper. No, please, no. 5178. Has a Hobgoblin ever taken over executive control in a human nation? Incidentally, Andy, how does Scotland this time of
the next 4 years?
That's a weird. Like, how is it this time? I don't. What?
Okay, Biofoot, I have no idea what you're referencing, other than possibly our Parliament speaking out against a particular vote of late and just how awful it was, which our Parliament absolutely did. Thanks, Green Party, you did your job. But have the Hobgoblins ever done this? As far as we know, no. There is no example of this being the case. There is lots of examples of encountering humanity, and it's fair to say that it does not go down well from the very beginning, but it is worth saying no is probably the correct answer.
Yes, though Hobgoblins do show up a lot as mercenaries, and they have a very, very mixed reputation. Do fishmen trade with Hobgoblins? Doubtful, seeing as the Hobgoblins hang out in the dry steppes, which are mostly just a big land of plains and a couple of forests, but so probably not. Do we know much about Hobgoblin attacks on Cathay? We know that we know that the Hobgoblins were bad enough that they contributed heavily to why the Great Wall was built.
Yep.
And that despite the Great Bastion being built, they are still a problem, which says a lot.
We have some nice quotations about the Hobgoblins and Cathay in several editions of Warhammer. As a single example, in 6th edition Warhammer, inside its background material in the core rulebook, they make it quite clear that Hobgoblin Khan is responsible for the creation of many of the great bastions in the north because of the enormous number of attacks that had come from the Khanate. It's worth noting, though, that Hobgoblin Khan is not an individual. It's almost a title that's been passed down from one Hobgoblin Khan to the next. So we're not talking about in recent history this has occurred. This has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that is one of the reasons why the Great Wall was built, according to some versions of the background. You'll find, though, that, as is often the case with Warhammer, whenever they bring out a new thing, that new thing is what's responsible for everything. So you'll find that it varies according to which book you read.
That's such an accurate statement. New toy. It's actually the bad of everything that's going on everywhere. It's been here all along. Mornington Crescent. In the end times, it should have been the Hobgoblins who opened the doors to Zarnagrand. That would have been a good twist on the ancient story. I agree.
It absolutely should have been. Yeah, it should be. There is a core trait for Hobgoblins that's been existent in the species pretty much almost since the beginning, and that's that they are treacherous and cannot be trusted. And the Chaos Dwarves, contrary to how it's often portrayed, the Chaos Dwarves actually trust them in a way they really shouldn't. And having had that as the outcome of the story would have been a beautiful end circle. If we were doing how would we do the end times? That would be one thing we would do. It would be the Hobgoblins that bring the Chaos Dwarves down.
Yeah, because that would suit them on such a level. But it's intro time. I'm actually really excited for this because there are some things about the Hobgoblins that y'all will genuinely not expect.
Yeah, let's see if we touch upon them in this intro. Okay, so Hobgoblins in the beginning. Yeah, I'm going to go right to the beginning again because Hobgoblins, contrary to many people's expectation for Warhammer, have been around since quite literally the beginning. And I mean literally. Warhammer 1st edition. All the way back, Warhammer 1st edition. So we're talking, what year? That'd be 1983, if I remember correctly. Warhammer 1st edition had stats and rules for Hobgoblins. They were given prime position alongside your elves and your dwarves and your various humans of the north, south, east, and west as it was presented all the way back in the version of Warhammer. There's no Warhammer world yet. It's just forces of fantasy. All the great fantasy species getting together with historical species and kicking living crap out of each other. good times. And the very first Hobgoblins are presented in a slightly different way to how they will become in later editions. In that at this point, they're definitely somewhere between goblins and orcs, but they're presented as a species that is known for frenzy, for their crazed attacks, and they are subject to hatred of all humans, elves, and dwarves. They despise them all, and that's about it. We don't get a great deal more. Much is the case for most of Warhammer First Edition. The detail is low, the editing is not necessarily great, but we get ourselves the foundation of what will become Warhammer later. It's not till we hit second edition that we get our first real idea of what's going to slowly but surely turn into Warhammer World Hobgoblins. And that's with Ravening Hordes. Now, if you don't know what Ravening Hordes is, it's the first release for Warhammer second edition that gave you all of the different armies. It's a name that would come up again and again in later editions of Warhammer, right up to the old world when they released Warhammer Ravening Hordes. Forces of Fantasy was the first edition equivalent, which you'll also note, for those of you who are old world players, has been used again in the most recent one. Do you have something?
I just want to interrupt briefly to say it was so stupid of Games Workshop not to use those two names as the books instead of Forces of Good and Forces of Evil.
Oh,
stupid. That's all I'm saying.
What a mess. I completely agree. But in 1987, as Ravening Hordes came out, we got our first actual real detail about what made Warhammer Hobgoblins different to just general fantasy Hobgoblins. And that's that they came from the stepplands to the east of the World's Edge Mountains. At this point, though, they are basically just warriors and archers, and they're mercenaries. So these are troops that could be picked up by any evil group, and you get yourself a bunch of Hobgoblin warriors and Hobgoblin archers. How much fun is that? And over the course of the development of the Warhammer world, Hobgoblins would always be sitting there in the background. This little thing where they'd say, oh yes, Hobgoblins exist. So by the time we hit the third edition of the game, Hobgoblins are very much a part of it. And when it brings out its equivalent to Ravening Hordes, which was called Warhammer Armies, by this point they've decided to pretty much use all their titles for their books to say exactly what it is. Ravening Hordes was seen to be too esoteric. What does it even mean? Warhammer Armies is clear. It's your army. And in Warhammer Armies at the back, it's got a host of special mercenary groups that you can hire in. And this includes Hobgoblins. And the development of the Hobgoblins since second edition into third has changed them. They've gone from these step-leaning greenskins into a proper Hobgoblin-led group. In the third edition of Warhammer Armies, we have some core facts that will never change. One is the note of the Morngul tribe. This is brought up again and again through later editions, and we've most recently been mentioned in 2024. I'll get to that later. The Morngul tribe is the actual tribe of Hobgoblin Khan himself, and he leads a great confederate of tribes, Hobgoblin tribes, but they are not wolf riders yet. Modern Hobgoblins are known for being effectively like real-world Mongols. Great horse-riding groups, but they ride wolves instead, riding across the steppe and conquering everything in their way. The Hobgoblins at this point, though, have no wolf riders, literally none. In fact, there's only one who can be mounted, and that's their little Hobgoblin general, and he gets mounted on a temple dog. So in third edition, we have a temple dog riding Hobgoblin Khan, which is pretty awesome. But they do have a couple of interesting troop types, which will never be seen again, but are worth noting because you'll find that if someone comes along and says, I want to make a Hobgoblin army that's purely a Hobgoblin Khan army, they'll almost certainly pull out at least one of these. One is the Hobyars, which is an amusing name, a portmanteau from other names, which is the idea of a Hobgoblin noble. So these are the Hobgoblins that lead the other ones, but it gives you the idea of a nobility. Now, greenskins at this point were known for their nobility across the board. That's where the word nob comes from. If you've ever heard of a good old orc nob. An orc nob is just an orc noble. And this in time turns into an orc that's beaten up all the other orcs and becomes bigger. But at this earlier component, there was the concept of a noble amongst the greenskins. And the Hobgoblin equivalent, which was the hobnob, effectively, the Hobyar, the Hobyar is included. They also include hobhounds. And this is the first time we get proper wolves, big, huge war dogs that are attached to the hobgoblins. And the hobhounds are these great, massive, not mastiffs, but like ferocious wolves that are whipped into place by the hobgoblins. And that's fun. They also mentioned the Great Horde for the first time in the actual Warhammer army list, so that's good too. We've got the idea of this Great Horde, but interestingly, none of it's mounted, at least as far as this mercenary contingent is concerned. And it's that eventually gets developed over the course of time as we then move into the rather famous 4th edition of Warhammer. And I say that the 4th edition is famous because this is when the Warhammer world, as we know and love it today, is pinned down. Up to 3rd edition, it had all been kind of feeling it out. And we've got this thing that, how does it work? Let's just make it up and make it a detail. And the Hobgoblins sort of existed as a thing up to this point, as a Eastern steppe kind of thing. They've got Hobgoblin the Khanites, they're probably like Mongols. Yeah, that's funny, ha ha ha. And Warhammer 4th edition came. High Elves, as we know them today, were made. The Empire, as we know it, was consolidated. Orcs and Goblins, consolidated. Undead, Nagash, all the rest of it, consolidated. And then the Hobgoblins got their go, but they kind of didn't. In a series of White Dwarf articles, the Chaos Dwarf army was made. And a host of new miniatures were made for the Chaos Dwarfs. And the Chaos Dwarf army included Hobgoblin slaves. People that the Chaos Dwarves had taken from the Eastern steppe and enslaved into service. And these Hobgoblins were completely different to the Hobgoblins from the previous generations. But they were also the same. They were shorter than orcs. They were taller than goblins. They were lean. They were thin. They were evil looking, filled with jagged teeth. But a couple of extra details were added. Number one, they had enormous hunchbacks on their backs. And this is, I'm going to argue, one of the most important details of their species, because it's marked inside the description of these White Dwarf articles that would later become the Chaos Dwarf Army List. White Dwarf presents Chaos Dwarf Army List. This came out in 1994, by the way, right by Christmas. I remember it really well. I was working for Games Workshop at the time, and it was the Christmas Warhammer release, and everyone was really peeved because they were like, but this is just White Dwarf articles. Why isn't it its own thing? Not realizing that that was pretty much how Games Workshop had built half of its stuff previously. They just hadn't said this was how it was done, and that all the army lists had been previewed through White Dwarfs and then released. But in this case, it was just White Dwarf articles, new material added for Chaos Dwarfs. And this is great. Hunchbacks, it's described as coming from either one of two sources. Luck. Why would that be lucky? Because the Hobgoblins are described as the most cunning, devious, and importantly, treacherous of all greenskins. Treachery is a core component of their society. Turning your back on someone is always considered foolish, and they always go for the back. A front attack is something that they don't like doing. They get scared of that sort of thing. They keep away from it. They prefer stabbing in the back. And all Hobgoblins have got large hunchbacks to protect themselves from this, which then leads to the second reason why it happened. Reason number one is it just sort of happened. They were lucky. Reason number two, natural selection and evolution. Now, if you know anything about natural selection and evolution, you know that that doesn't just take 1,000 years or 2,000 or 5,000. That is something that occurs over the course of millennia upon millennia to a millennia of millennia. Evolution is not a short thing. It's a long-term thing, which leaves you with the Hobgoblins don't know why they have this big hump, but they have one. And it speaks directly to their society. I'm going to pick this up a little bit later because there is something important being discussed here. I don't think Games Workshop's thought about with any great degree at all, which probably should have been thought about. So we've got ourselves these great hunched-backed goblins that stand just slightly shorter than a man. They're really skinny in comparison to an orc, but they're relatively bulky in comparison to a goblin. And they are evil looking. According to some descriptions, they have hair, long, lank, black hair, but I will say that the reason that they have that is for racist stereotype reasons. So some descriptions of them just remove that and it just didn't happen anymore. We don't want to discuss that ever being the case. Other descriptions, it very much is the case because they're pulling on almost racist traditions of what a Mongol might look like with lank hair and a long thin moustache without any realization of what the actual cultures really were. So the Hobgoblins picked up all this detail and became the Mongols, if you will, of the East that had been enslaved by the Chaos Dwarfs. And inside this army list, we get ourselves a couple of fun details. Number one, we get ourselves our core warriors and archers. We also get ourselves, for the first time, our sneaky gits. So all the way back in 1994, the sneaky gits make their first appearance. Now, the sneaky git is the worst, most treacherous of all hobgoblins. Truly the worst of the worst species already. And these sneaky gits are basically just hobgoblins on steroids in that they always stab for the back. They carry long curved blades so they can get around at your back, and they are pretty decent in close combat, which is the opposite of how most of the race has been discussed so far. But they get benefits for obviously stabbing you in the back, which is great. Beyond this, we also get one really important key fact. There's quite a few details about the Chaos Dwarf history, which is sort of worth discussing. I'm sure we will as we go on through the stream. But one detail is worth pointing out, and that is that Hobgoblins are universally hated by all other greenskins, despised with a passion.
Yep.
And the reason that they discuss that they are despised is because of the great treachery that occurs inside Zarnagarund, where one of the great slave revolts, the orcs are rising, all the greenskins, in fact, are rising up against their Chaos Dwarf masters. The Hobgoblins betray the other greenskins right at a key moment when the entirety of the Chaos Dwarves are likely to be wiped out, side with the Chaos Dwarves, and thus defeat all the other greenskins. And through doing so, get themselves an enormously influential place inside Chaos Dwarf society, which will vacillate in description according to which book you read. In some books, the Chaos Dwarves actually respect the greenskins, the hobgoblins, pardon me, in a way that they don't any other greenskin, in that they are given slave master positions, they're used as warriors, they're seen as exceedingly capable. But in other descriptions, the Chaos Dwarves view the hobgoblins as no better or worse than any other greenskin. But just be aware that there are conflicting versions of the background here. In some, they are very much trusted. In others, they're not trusted at all. In others, it's a little bit more nuanced. And it's like, yeah, everybody knows these guys are super, super treacherous. But because we treat them in a particular way, it ensures that they're never treacherous against us. Now, the important part of all this is that all greenskins hate hobgoblins. And that's fascinating, because the vast majority of the greenskins in the world would care nothing about what happens in Zarnagarund. Literally nothing. Literally nothing at all. Literally nothing. But it's a universal trait. In the same way that there's a universal trait that goblins are afraid of elves.
Of elves. Yeah.
And again, it doesn't make a great deal of sense unless you start looking for an overall picture as to why these things work. But at this point, we get that key trait nailed down, and it will never change. So 1994 is when the Hobgoblin Canet is when the Hobgoblins and the Chaos Dwarves, when the Hobgoblins, being the sneaky, treacherous gits that are hated by all other greenskins, are nailed into place and will never change. These are now core traits. As is the case for most things Warhammer, the 4th edition of Warhammer pretty much stamps down the core details that will never be changed in later editions. It's almost like this 1994, 1995, let's say, roadmap for Warhammer becomes a core that they will never change. So past this, they're sort of ignored, and there's a reason why they're sort of ignored. Chaos Dwarves did not sell very well. And I'll be blunt. I used to work in retail at the time. They did not sell very well at all. Sure, there was a few Chaos Dwarf armies out there. There were certainly a few people who loved the nature of the hobgoblins and what they represented. But the Chaos Dwarves themselves looked super goofy. They had giant hats, ridiculous blunderbusses. Their monsters are pretty cool, Great Taurus or the Lamassu or whatever, but they look kind of goofy. And when you put them on the map in comparison to some of the other Warhammer armies, even the goofiest ones, the greenskins, were often goofy through this era. They still looked monstrous or horrible or whatever. The Chaos Dwarves always looked a bit daft. And it's fair to say they didn't sell that well. So by the time that we hit the next edition of Warhammers, we're moving deep into 5th now, and we've got the Dogs of War coming out, you'd expect them being mercenaries for them to be highlighted and brought to the fore. They are not. When Dogs of War come out in 1998, the Dogs of War detail basically Tilia. So this is the Warhammer equivalent of Italy, and they reshape it all as this great place of individual warlords and princes fighting against each other with great mercenary bands. And they don't include any hobgoblins in this. Now, the obvious answer to that would be, well, that's because they're in Tilia, really, really far away from there, surely. But in Dogs of War, right at the very back, it's got a lovely little detail about Hobgoblin Khan. Of all people. There he is, coming front and center yet again. And in there, it describes Hobgoblin Khan as having an empire that stretches from horizon to horizon, created from all the tribes of the hobgoblins that exist across the steppe. And they are effectively holding that entire area. And Hobgoblin Khan can, if he wishes, bind them all together. And he's described there as the greatest threat that the North holds and the greatest threat to trade routes, because at the back of the Dogs of War, they're discussing all the different trade routes that Tilia have, and they've opened up and how they opened them and when they were opened. And the North was considered to be too dangerous, more dangerous than going through Ogre lands. And the reason it was more dangerous to the Ogre lands is because the Ogres would trade, would be open to working with people passing through, could be bought out. Your Greases of the group, so to speak. Where the Hobgoblins were too treacherous. You could never be certain that you could get through. And there we go. That's it. But it isn't quite. In support of Dogs of War, we get ourselves a bunch of really interesting details. And through the course of White Dwarf, one in particular is worth calling out. In 1999, in White Dwarf number 231, somebody check that one up for me, please. 231? Yeah, pretty sure it's 231. They detail Gazrat Khan. Now, Gazrat Khan is a really interesting hobgoblin because he is, in many respects, going to provide a template for what hobgoblins are, because he's the only one in recent editions that we've had detailed. And Gazrat Khan is fascinating because he is a mercenary captain. No, he's not. As you look at it, he's a mercenary general. He leads an enormous mercenary group in Tilia, and it's not small. He is working with the local mercenary princes, being hired by those princes to work for and work with them. And what's included in his great horde of hobgoblins? Well, a lot of things, including goblins and orcs. One of the units is called out the Long Knife Orc Warriors, or the rather oddly Manglar's Mutant Goblins. They're all part of his great mercenary contingent, which is fun. He has an enormous chunk of trolls, the War Trolls of the Grey Mountains, as they're called. They're super fun as well. Goreskull, who leads them, gets detailed in one of the Citadel compendiums. I think it's Citadel Journal, maybe it'll be in the mid-30s somewhere, maybe late 30s, in one of the Citadel journals. And Nick Kime picked up what had been detailed inside White Dwarf and added a whole bunch of details about these war trolls. But to cut a long story short, what we have is possibly the seed to why all greenskins are really deeply suspicious of hobgoblins. Because we have a hobgoblin outside of a Wa who has pulled underneath him hobgoblins, orcs, goblins, all of them. And to make it even more interesting, they work alongside humans, in support of humans, with humans, and are completely, as far as greenskins are concerned, controlled, which is weird. Really weird.
You are correct, by the way, that it is 231 with Gazrat Khan and Ogla Khan's wolf boys.
Yeah. I'm on it. So you've got loads of cool, and these are proper hobgoblins of the steppe. So they are proper wolf boys with the classic tactics of the Mongols, and they are enormously influential. So you'd think that this group would hopefully be pulled into the 6th edition of the game when it came out in 2000, and it kind of is. In 2000, 6th edition of the game, when it gets released, inside the army lists inside there, which is, I think they called it Ravening Hordes again. I think it was Ravening Hordes. I'm pretty sure 6th edition opened up with Ravening Hordes inside its release. Had an army list for everything, and the Chaos Dwarves are mentioned, and Hobgoblins are mentioned, but this is the last time that Warhammer Fantasy Battle would have any stats from the studio for Chaos Dwarves or Hobgoblins, pretty much. Other than this, we're then moving to non-primary sources or different games. I'll get to that in a second. So 2000 is when it stops. The Khanate is no longer discussed in any great degree. Hobgoblins are kind of not discussed. Chaos Dwarves are dropped to the point that everyone thinks they're squatted. That classic term which suggests that they have gone the way of the squats in Warhammer 40k. And the way of the squats in Warhammer 40k was they were dropped, forgotten, never happened. Tyranids ate them. These never happened. They just don't exist anymore until they do.
And suddenly they're back. Yeah.
And suddenly they're back. And indeed, this is exactly, to a degree, what happens with Hobgoblins. They are ignored for 11 years. They are something that is left and relegated to a slight mention here at the back of a story or something similar, but nothing more. But in 2011, they're not just re-tackled, they're not just reimagined, they are given a full set of stats for the 8th edition of Warhammer. And this is in the book that we've discussed on the stream multiple times, Tamarkan, The Throne of Chaos. And in The Throne of Chaos, we have a slew of, Now, contrary to what this book does for almost everything else, I'm not going to say a slew of new details. It's a slew of old details, really.
Mostly reprint, yeah.
It's mostly just taking what came before and saying, you know what, this does exist in our Warhammer world. Most of the new stuff went to the Chaos Dwarves. In fact, I'm going to go further. They go backwards. They removed the Sneaky Gits. The Sneaky Gits are gone. What we have instead is Cutthroats. We have ourselves Cutthroats are our basic warriors. Yes, do you want to say something there?
So I want to say the reason for that, interestingly, is because GW took the Sneaky Gits and put them in the Greenskin roster as a Goblin unit upgrade.
Quite. So Sneaky Gits are gone. We have Cutthroats instead. We no longer have the most treacherous of the treacherous species, Sneaky Gits, obviously. But we do have our Wolf Riders. And interestingly, we have a new detail which wasn't previously there, and that's that the leaders of the Hobgoblins inside the Chaos Dwarf contingent refer to themselves as Khans, using the same title that is used by the Khanate warlords over with the steppe-based Hobgoblins. So they're looking outwards and saying, we claim that title in here as well. And in some respects shows the enormous amount of control and authority that they could potentially have within the Chaos Dwarf Empire. They view themselves as little kings within this particular empire, which I think is a really nice little detail. So as small details go, it's a fun one because it, again, allows them to discuss the Khanate and the Great Steppe lands where they are taking their slaves from. It's also worth noting that they copy over one detail, and that's that the Wolf Riders are not generally slaves. This is the case in the old edition army list as well. They're generally hired in mercenaries. And these are mercenaries that they pull in because the Wolf Riders are skilled troops. The slave contingents are generally the warriors and the sneaky gits and similar. They're not the ones that are riding the wolves. In the most recent one, Tamarkan, the Wolf Riders are discussed as being treated as badly as the slaves. That's not the case in the earlier army list, where they're giving begrudging respect because they have to be, but they're not particularly well paid because the Chaos Dwarves don't like paying them well much. So there's a few interesting little details there, but we get the idea that we've got Hobgoblins who are both slaves and not slaves with the Chaos Dwarves. And this is pretty much it for the 8th edition of Warhammer. After this, Warhammer blows up and dies. We all know about that. The end times occur. The Hobgoblins are ignored because screw them. The Chaos Dwarves, oh yeah, everything gets killed over in the East. We know that already. All of that doesn't matter because they don't really discuss the East in the slightest. So we don't really know what happens with the great Hobgoblin Khan in the North, someone who is supposedly potentially so powerful that he could take down Cathay itself. Yeah, no, let's not discuss that. Instead, we have ourselves licensors. Because at the death of Warhammer, Games Workshop then went out to other companies and said, if you wish, give us all the money, you can use Warhammer in your own products. And you can make products for Warhammer. That's where things like Warhammer Total War step in. Things like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition step in, where they can then go, here's all of Games Workshop's properties, and here's some new material for it. But you'll find in both Total War's case and Games Workshop, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, they have done nothing really new. All they've done is they've taken all the previous stuff and gone, how can we use that? And then pitched it in their individual games. So the Hobgoblin Khanate does exist. Exactly how. For example, if we go to Tribes and Tribulations for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, it just takes the old idea of the Tilian Khanate, the chap who's kicking around, gives him some stats. Very bad ones, by the way. He's truly rubbish. I mean, my basic PCs could kick him in.
Cubicle 7, what are you going to do? Yeah.
Really bad. But they don't really add anything new. The only detail in that entire book, which I would say is potentially new, is consolidating that Hobgoblins have hair. They say it specifically in their description, which in other descriptions suggest it may have been hair squigs or something else. But no, they're very much laid out as having hair. They're greasy, bank hair. And then that leads us up to the modern day. And what do we have? We have a group that have been in Warhammer since the very first edition of the game. A group that started off as a relatively racist stereotype of the Mongol on the steppe being a barbarian with zero intelligence that kills everyone. That stereotype was sort of massaged over time and turned into, actually, it's a great group of greenskins. It's not that bad, really, into, we're not thinking about them at all. In fact, we don't even want to discuss them. Let's not discuss them. We'll just do the Chaos Dwarves instead. So they didn't need to deal with the fact that they just rewritten the Mongols as a bunch of unruly barbarians with zero thought as to how people from that area might think about their own history being reused, because they just didn't care. And then from that point, we end up with what we have with the modern licensors, where they have a host of material that's been written over multiple editions of the game, all of which say there's a Khanate, there's a steppe, there's Chaos Dwarves, there's slaves, there's treacherous Hobgoblins. They are the worst. They're sneaky gets probably until we hit the old world. And then the old world said, you know what? All of that is definitely a thing. Because when the old world was released, not long afterwards, they released their army list, which was called, what was the one? I don't know if they got names. Did they get names for the individual releases that they did for their legacy army list? They didn't. I think they're just called legacy army lists. So that got released this year. Yeah. the Legacy Army list. And in there, we have Khans, we have Sneaky Gits. The Sneaky Gits are back as part of the Chaos Dwarf Army list. The Chaos Dwarves are marked there with Khans, Sneaky Gits, Wolf Riders, the lot. It's all there. Everything that had been discussed previously is in the old world. The only thing that they doesn't include is what sort of greenskin are they? And that's what I'm going to finish my intro on. Because there's actually, behind all of this, a far bigger conversation. And that's that through the course of the 90s, Warhammer changed greenskins. And Warhammer 40k changed its greenskins also. It started with 40k, and really quite early in 40k's genesis, all the way back in its first edition, where they went, our greenskins, they're not just fantasy orcs. What they are is their own species that have spores that they reproduce with. They don't have men and women. They just have orcs. They just have Gretchen, goblins in their case, and they're snotlings and similar. And these come from sacs that grow underneath mushrooms, and they come out from the earth, and they are their own thing. And Warhammer started picking up on this. And that was controversial because Warhammer 1st edition, 2nd edition, and 3rd edition, they had female orcs. 4th edition, it was never mentioned, or 5th or 6th. It just wasn't mentioned at all. And in fantasy roleplay, it kind of wasn't mentioned after the 1st edition either. And there was always this question by the developers and the writers behind the scenes of, are all Warhammer orcs unique Warhammer creatures, quite unlike normal fantasy orcs, and they don't have females? Or are they not? What are Warhammer greenskins? And the question became so open that when we started writing about it, when I was writing about it in the mid-2000s, we were told not to answer it. We were told specifically not to do so. And then one question was asked. Wait a minute, if they are 40k analogs, we've got our Gretchen, our goblins, our orcs. What the hell's a hobgoblin? How does it fit into this model? Are they a different species? Are they even greenskins? Are they the same thing, or are they something different? Are they something different? What the? And at this time, it was a question, particularly because the Ogre army list had been released very recently at the point when we were having these discussions. And the Ogre Kingdoms, the first one, introduced the concept of the Noblar. And the Noblar was a different type of small greenskin. And it also, through the course of its release, suggested there was different types of greenskin all over the place. So again, the question came up behind the scenes. Are these fungus or are they not? And Warhammer 8th edition gave us an answer. They were. Greenskins were fungus who had arrived along with the old ones. And they had a fungal basis. And that caused an immense amount of difficulty, because then the question came up of, well, what's a hobgoblin? What's a noblar? What are they? Are they greenskins too? Are they associated with fungus? Do they have female hobgoblins? Do they not have female hobgoblins? Are they even the same species? Now, if we go to early Warhammer, it marks out hobgoblins as being a goblinoid, and a goblinoid that can crossbreed with orcs and goblins and humans, which is fascinating because that means that they're all the same species. But let's just not think about that too hard. But they could crossbreed, and hobgoblins could crossbreed with others. But that's presumably either A, not the case anymore, or is it? Who can say? I'm going to end my introduction by saying we don't know what hobgoblins are, but we do know this. They have gigantic, massive humps on their back to protect against backstabbing. They have shown an enormous amount of evolutionary difference in comparison to any of the other goblinoid species. If you wanted to have an immediate first answer, let's open with controversy. Let's open with me just saying, how about, let's open it a bit more holistically. Let's view it from a bigger picture. Okay. Hobgoblins are not normal greenskins. We can say that for certain. And they are hated by greenskins for being something that they shouldn't be, as is often marked as treacherous. The greenskins as a whole are also something that the old ones apparently didn't want in the world. So perhaps the hobgoblins are the answer. And with that, I complete my intro. Hey, done in exactly half an hour. Good job.
You're right. Yeah. So there are a couple of little things I want to add, but I'm going to do the super chats first. And then I'm going to kind of pick at we're going to work our way through some various notes and subjects and things that have just kind of come up that I think will make for very, very interesting discussion. But first, we're going to get all caught up on these, because if I don't do it now, I'm going to forget. Let's see. We were here. Traditional anxiety. My old friend. If orcs have a natural revulsion to chaos, do hobgoblins also share this revulsion? Or are the Darkland hobgoblins unique in working with chaos? So there is a difference. It may not seem like it because of the name, but there is a notable difference between the chaos and the weird stuff that tends to make greenskins really, really uncomfortable, and the chaos dwarfs, which are a different thing. They're similar, but there are notable differences. One of the things that's interesting about greenskins, when you delve into deeper lore with them, is that greenskins are a very superstitious species, which can sound like a weird word when you look at like Warhammer Fantasy. Like, how can someone be superstitious in the fantasy world when like practically everything is actually real? But greenskins have a notable habit of, if something does not follow like the natural laws of the world, it could spook them pretty bad. Whether it's like spiritual undead or demons or like things that mutate and cause, really, greenskins don't like that shit. They like when things
I'll just drop in a very quick comment on that. Consider greenskin superstition like classic literally inbred, as in it's a part of your innate things, fear of spiders. Most humans and most kids have a fear of spiders. We, when we're children, have neophobia, fear of anything new, because we're afraid that it might be poisonous. It's built into our genes. And similarly for orcs, anything that's weird and magical is immediately something that they veer away from, as effectively written into their code: watch out for magic shit, it will kill you. So it's not weird at all in the slightest. It makes a lot of sense. It manifests as superstition, but in fact is nothing more than inbred concern for magical shit, which makes sense because you'd want to stay away from that if you were a young orc.
Yep. It also makes you wonder about what their creation was intended for. But moving on.
Moving on.
Viper Wolf, do hobgoblins have goblin slaves? So the Khanate itself, there are very vague mentions that the Khanate will capture people and often sell them like to the Chaos Dwarfs or to some of the Chaos tribes that are up in the north that they have very tumultuous relationships with. But generally speaking, they seem to, if they're going to capture you, they're either going to eat you or they're going to sell you to somebody else.
So I'll go further than that. I'll say that we only have one clear example, and that's, well, from White Dwarf with Gazak Khan himself. And Gazak quite clearly has goblins in his army. So they are a component of their army. So do they have goblin slaves? I mean, if they have slaves, the answer is almost certainly yes, they will have goblins. Goblins to them are just shorter things that they can easily bully into place. Got to remember, a core component of hobgoblin psyche is treachery. Anyone who isn't treacherous is deemed with deep suspicion. You should always be out for yourself. And being out for yourself means using other people. So using goblins, absolutely.
Yeah, which there is an irony in that I actually like a lot, of the idea that the hobgoblins have such an innate sense of treachery and of an individualist look at society, that to them, someone that is not attempting to take advantage of a situation is worrisome. Like, that is a genuine threat that is noticed by them, which is a very interesting perspective for them to have. It's funny, but it's also genuinely interesting.
Yeah, and it's also innate. It's a part of their character. In the same way that human society, we are by nature, we are innate a social group. We work at our best working in groups, and if we are isolated, tend to go a little bit insane. We go a bit weird. Hobgoblins, similarly, if they're not looking out for themselves, they go a bit insane and a bit weird. They are entirely self-motivated. And that being the case, they are very unlike most greenskins, who their very component parts are band together, find the strongest, follow strongest. They're almost anti-greenskin, and that in many respects shows why the other greenskins view them with such contempt, because they are contemptuous. They are utterly unlike what a greenskin should be. They're almost anti-greenskin, even though they demonstrate many of what we on the outside would see the same traits. You go, well, goblins are treacherous, aren't they? They're out for themselves. Yeah, but they band up. They form small Waa's, even they're little Waa. They band up under Mork and Gork, and I think in some respects as well, it speaks to are Mork and Gork core components of their society? Later writers almost certainly will say yes, but as it currently stands, the answer is no. They're not mentioned anywhere.
Yeah,
With
there's
any great strength.
I actually do want to dial in on this for a second. Of that, there's a really interesting amount of theorizing you could do when it comes to what Andy said that I love and really want to dial in on is that the greenskin or the hobgoblins are greenskins, and they take that to a very interesting level. Of one of the things that's talked about in the Tribes of Tribulation book is that the hobgoblins, and this actually is reflected as well in the Tarmacon book when it talks about the wolf riders. For greenskins, they're very good at following orders and using advanced tactics, which is something that regular greenskins are like shitty about. Like they're horrible at it. Like they're constantly like infighting and bickering, and it makes like, you know, the one orc Gorbad Ironclaw who can actually issue them orders that they'll follow, like a devastating into the world tier bad guy. Whereas for the hobgoblins, it's more natural. Like despite the fact they're such hardcore backstabbers, they actually work in groups really well together.
Yeah.
Which is
I'm going to reinforce this. This is something that Tribe and Tribulations picked up from the White Dwarf articles with Gazak, because it's how he's portrayed. And interestingly, he is portrayed as someone who was not capable of holding off against Hobgoblin Khan's might. He was kicked out because he just wasn't as good as them. And he's come out and become one of the most important figures in the West from his perspective of East. An extraordinary general who is capable of mustering greenskins under his banner. And that is not anything but the norm from where he comes from. And under his banner, orcs, goblins, trolls, the rest. And they are all working to his command. And I think that that is in and of itself fascinating. And also from the greenskins perspective, deeply worrying. Because greenskins don't marshal in that way. They just don't do that. Unless there is an extraordinary individual. And it appears to be the case that when hobgoblins are concerned, they are the extraordinary individuals. They may not have the weight, the meat of an orc. They may not have the cunning, so to speak, of the goblin. But in some respects, they have got the mind, the proper tactical know-how to do all of it in a way that the other greenskins are just left puzzling, going, what's going on here?
Yeah, in a funny way, you could almost argue that they're the most human of the greenskins, which is spooky and also kind of hilarious.
And very possibly the source of the half-orc.
Yep.
Not the orcs, as is often done. Now, if I was writing it, I would purposely have said that the half-orc came from potentially the hobgoblins, not the orcs. Because the orcs quite clearly are a bit different.
Barnak, KGW, you know, hey, Games Workshop, you know that Mongols split into mini cultures like Kazakh and Tatar? Nah, people of Ostermark and Mongols are just Mongols with different accent. Yeah, welcome to the...
just to generally speak on this one, it's one of the things I actually despise about Warhammer writing. And I've been involved with this and done the same thing myself because I'm following other people's templates. And that's that the education of the UK has determined a great deal of what has been made for Warhammer. And UK education focuses upon British history, a little bit of European history, and a couple of flashpoints beyond that. And the flashpoints beyond that are from the East, the Great Mongol invasion. Yep, that's mentioned. China's a thing, honest. Oh yeah, Chinese opium wars, that's important. Japan sort of happened once, bombs and stuff, and that's it. So what happens with Warhammer? We get loads of versions of the Mongols coming in. We get China mentioned as Cathay. We get Nippon. And that's about it, where in truth, there are so many groups of people over there, so many cool things that they could have drawn upon, and they absolutely ignored. And as is also the case for UK education with those parts, they often only focus on the salient points that stand at the top. And that is, as far as most of the Western monarchies were concerned, when the arrival of the Mongols, God, I said that. The Mongols. There we go. They were nothing more than crazed barbarians from the East that were monsters, where the truth of the case was something quite different. But instead, in Warhammer, they're turned into greenskin monsters. And they are monsters, the worst creatures you can imagine. And that is why many of the writers at the time were like, can't we do something with these? And Games Workshop were often left going, we don't want to because it's kind of racist and weird. Let's ignore them. And they just moved on. So yeah, that's your point is very strong.
Yeah, and there's something I want to address really briefly. I'm going to make it brief, and then I'm going to get back to the Hobgoblins, but it's just something I want to bring up because I see it in the comments on Lorebeard episodes, and I'm tired of typing. And one thing I want to say is me and Andy talk a lot on this show about like the mistakes of earlier Warhammer and how a lot of the views of the cultures that show up in the setting are really pigeonholed and frankly very one-dimensional and often very racist. And there's always like 5 or 6 people that wander in the comments and be like, oh, Andy and Sotek are so woke and blah, 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 blah. It's like, listen, A, woke doesn't fucking mean anything. Stop saying it's a stupid fucking term. B, when it comes down to it, the Warhammer world at its best is a really fascinating, complex, diverse universe. And it suffers immensely when something that could be complex, like a whole chunk of the world, like the New World, gets divided into Aztec dinosaur people and elves. Yeah. That's half the fucking planet. And it's so bad and lazy, and it deserves to be criticized. Things should be done better. Things should be done with more nuance to tell more interesting stories. And it's not out of a sense, I mean, it is out of a sense of like people deserve to have their stories told, but it also just makes the world more interesting. Like even from a purely selfish, greedy position, you should want the world to be as complex and diverse as possible because that gives you infinitely more stories to play with.
Yeah, I could only agree more. I couldn't but agree, particularly because the Warhammer world is bigger than the real world.
Yeah,
it's just a bigger place. All of these places should have tons of really cool details and fascinating little subjects that can be popped up, and peoples that are so different and diverse and magical and strange and weird. But due to the way they're written, it's often one blanket area here is all this, and they're all monsters. And it's not a great way of world building. And that doesn't mean that the armies have to be great, diverse, weird things. You can just have your Hobgoblin Canny army, but what's happening up there should be interesting and diverse. And it very rarely is, which is a shame.
Yeah. And, fuck us. We just, we want things to be interesting. God forbid. All right, moving on. Bones. Would this hatred of hobgoblins be an oral tradition of the orcs, or is there something genetic being imprinted in their memories through generations? So, what I'll say here is that it seems to be genuinely it's imprinted. There is a deep, because it goes out of its way to say all orcs and goblins, not orcs and goblins of the Darklands, who may be aware of what happened hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago at Zarnagrin, even though greenskins are pretty shit at maintaining history, even orally. Because they just don't care.
Not just shit. I just don't think they would care. All greenskin oral stories aren't oral. They're genetic. They're the stuff that's in their genes, in the same way that every cat knows how to mouse, even if they've never learned it from another cat. They're not necessarily great at it, they know how to do it. All humans can breathe. All humans know how their basic structures work. They pick up language like nobody's business. We all have genetic programming to one degree or another. Orc genetic programming, greenskin genetic programming is, of all the species, almost certainly the strongest. And their genetic programming binds them together in a particular fashion that excludes hobgoblins. And that suggests to me that the hobgoblins are not the same type of greenskin as the rest of them, because they don't do the big thing that other greenskins do. We don't get hobgoblin waz.
Yeah, I want to go into a little bit of a theory thing here, which I think Andy was kind of hinting at this earlier, but I want to actually dial in on a little bit because it's
theory
fun.
Hammer.
It's what Lorebeards is for, and this is why y'all come here. So the thing that's really interesting is one of the theories. So greenskins, once again, all greenskins apparently hate hobgoblins. We're not just talking orcs. We're talking orcs, goblins, forest goblins, night goblins, snotlings, if they're capable of paying attention for that long, noblars. Like, greenskins are deeply uncomfortable with hobgoblins. And one of the things that's really interesting to me to think about is if you think about how, like, there's always that fun conspiracy that is probably very much not a conspiracy because there are ideas for it that are kind of punted around by evolutionary scientists of the idea of like the uncanny valley of that humans, for whatever reason, we have a programming in our system that if something is kind of like us, but it's off, we get profoundly scared and uncomfortable and angry towards whatever that thing is.
It makes sense because what we're looking at is genetic failure. So when something comes out wrong, you look at someone, you say there's something wrong with their genes. They're not made the same way. I don't want to breed with that person because that may be passed on to my children. It makes me uncomfortable. It's basic genetics at play. And the orcs have somewhat the same thing, but in a slightly different way. Because their genetics work differently, presumably according to how they reproduce. And greenskins do not like hobgoblins.
Yeah, and like Andy said, hobgoblins have to every writing, and I double-checked everything over the last 3 days, have never had a WA. They have never declared a WA. The only time they've done anything even WA-related was that Tribes in Tribulation actually bothered to talk about hobgoblin shamans. And even the hobgoblin shamans are weird. They use both lores. They use Little WA and Big WA, but they're not very good at them. Compared to other greenskins, which almost implies they have like a damaged relationship with WA.
I'll add one extra detail to that as well. And is this one worth going into? Yeah, it kind of is. It's not that. No, you carry on with your one. I'll sit in this one.
Okay, sure. So, but the thing that I like though about that is that traditionally, when you're dealing with not traditionally, just as a fact. When you're dealing with greenskins, they need a WA to build up the momentum to become a threat outside of exceptionally rare circumstances. Being like a goblin like Skarsnik, who's more, and Gorfang. But those are very rare individuals that kind of consolidate. What's fascinating about the hobgoblins is that while they do not declare WAs, they are constantly talked about as one of the greatest threats in the world of this mobile nation that is basically it's not that they're not wawing. It's almost more like they're in a perpetual WA that never ends and are just roaming around.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say they're in perpetual WA, because if they were, then the Hobgoblin would be in direct control of them all.
I don't think it's an actual WA. I'm just saying, like, in the sense that they're always moving around.
I would also, just to make sure that we're clear, state very clearly that Hobgoblins absolutely would be parts of WAs. Now, because they are, by their very nature, mercenaries. They work for others. In every edition of Warhammer, the Hobgoblin forces have always been that additional thing that sits on the edge. Even with the Chaos Dwarves, they were the addition. In first edition, they were Hobgoblins. Second edition, Hobgoblin mercenaries. Third edition, Hobgoblin mercenaries. They're mercenary types. We go to sixth edition, they were Hobgoblin mercenaries. Indeed, as we discussed, Kazakh Khan was the Hobgoblin mercenary general. They've always been willing to work with others. And they will be part of WAS as a mercenary contingent. Almost certainly getting pulled in by one tribe or another that's been caught up in this mighty WA. But they themselves don't appear to do it. Now, again, I think it's incumbent upon us to say that almost certainly at some point, the Hobgoblins are going to be detailed by Games Workshop. And the fact that they are green makes it exceedingly likely they will then say, you know what?
Will get WA rules.
They've got WA rules now, because that's what Games Workshop does. They often don't think about what they're doing with a great deal of depth. They just take the next thing, they write a White Dwarf article about it or something, go, here's a thing. And then we, on the outside, go, oh, well, you know, all that other stuff, it's been ignored now. So we're going to have to come up with a different theory. In this case, it's evidently clear that the Hobgoblins are territorial. They hold what they hold. They're deeply treacherous, cannot be trusted by anyone. You can't make deals with them. In Warhammer 6th edition, where they describe Hobgoblin Khan, they're very clear that he wipes out 9 out of every 10 of the various trading caravans that pass through. He basically says, sure, come on in. Stab. Sure, come on in. Stab. They're deeply treacherous. But because they're treacherous, sometimes they do let you through, because they're not consistent as well. They have an inconsistency that make the Ogre Kingdoms look like incredibly reliable partners, meaning that the Silk Roads to the south are doable. The roads to the north are insanely dangerous, but not because of chaos. Because of this band of greenskins you cannot rely upon in any way, shape, or form, even if you have long-standing deals. So, yeah, we've got ourselves a bunch of greenskins who have a different, unique trait about them, their giant backs, and an innate psychology that's completely different to all other greenskins. Treachery and individualism is at their core. So there must be a reason for this. And we only have two ways this can, in fact, we only have one way this can happen. No, two. This can happen in the Warhammer world. One is literal manipulation, genetic manipulation at a fundamental level, in the same way that the Black Orcs were created, in the same way that the Elves were created in the current form, the same way that the humans and the Dwarves and all the other Old One species were created, or alternatively, a freak of magic, something that occurred that changed something from one thing into another thing. And a freak event of magic can almost always be reinterpreted as Tzeentch made them, which is a deeply weird way of saying that multifaceted weirdo chaos god did something. But ultimately, magic is involved, and it wasn't a material thought process that made it happen. Tzeentch is pretty much responsible. So we can really lay this down to two hands. One, genetic manipulation. Someone took the orc DNA and turned it into something else. Or two, chaos fucked it up somehow. And given what they're doing, they're not that chaotic.
No,
they're not doing anything that is fundamental to the ultimate chaos plan. They're not like, say, manticores or whatever that went deeply evil or chaos related. They're never described as a chaos species that has to be cleansed, which means that we're pretty much left with they were made. And that is fascinating.
Yeah, Awesome Line Source, just want to point out your comment because the way this system works, it won't bring it up normally. But do you think we'll ever see the Hobgoblin Khanate in Total Warhammer 3 or hyped for the next DLC? Hope you guys are having a great stream. Are we hyped for the next DLC? Always, of course. More toys? Yeah. Great. Do I think we'll ever see them? I would say no, unless Games Workshop is intending to put them in the old world like in the next 1 to 2 years, in which case they might give them to CM and be like, you could do something with this. In which case, yeah. But
yeah, if Games Workshop want to use them, the answer is yes. If Games Workshop don't want to use them, the answer is no. I know that sounds really cop-out. But the licensing department are just a few people who sit there and they're the ones who say yes or no to any individual job. And they're given an overall direction by whoever's at the top. And the overall direction for the licensing department is generally whatever we are releasing or intending to release should be a focus. And that seems fair. And if that release pattern does not in any way include Hobgoblins, they're always going to say, yeah, probably not. Yeah, probably not. So the answer is probably not.
Phil, so Hobgoblins can work with other races for money rather than attack them on sight. Yep. All greenskins despise them instinctively, and they've ruined one of the biggest scraps in the history of greenskins. It is safe to say that these are signs Gork and Mork have forsaken them, because that would explain a lot. Possibly.
I kind of regret that Trials and Tribulations gave them access to the lore of the Little Wa and the lore of the Wa, because it gave a really good potential story a quick cutoff. And that the potential story could have been, yeah, they have nothing to do with Gork and Mork at all. And that's another reason why instinctually it really doesn't work in the slightest for the greenskins and them. They are fundamentally different. But that's not the case. They are calling upon those particular deities. That being the case, the answer is actually here, not quite. Now, it might not work perfectly for them, but the answer here is they haven't been forsaken, or worse, they can somehow steal it, which I think is better. They're treacherous.
Oh, that would be spicy.
They are taking from Mork and Gork in a way that makes all the other greenskins go, that's just not right. And that, for me, I think makes a better story, particularly given the nature of how greenskin magic can work. It works around the idea of that great culmination of greenskins creating that energy, which is then translated into effect. Having the Hobgoblins work in a slightly different way is always a good thing. But honestly, strict answer here is currently no.
Yeah, going back to that earlier comment, super chat from Warzag, it'd actually be really interesting if the Hobgoblins were the quote-unquote heretics of greenskin culture.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that one.
Sean Schultz, what do you call a goblin brigand? A Rob Goblin.
Hey, someone's going for your title there.
Jonathan Scott, a pack of 30 wolves requires 50 to 1,000 square kilometers of territory, and the Hobgoblins don't farm a herd, so how do they feed thousands of wolves? Presumably,
classic Warhammer question.
Yeah, Warhammer does not give a shit about how any of that works, and they never have. Because otherwise, you look at a map of the Empire and you start going, "No, this doesn't work." Like where all the rivers and everything are and stuff. But What I will say is keep in mind that greenskins and wolves, and you see this with a lot of greenskins. Greenskins can eat damn near anything. That's meat, especially. And what you often find up, the Eastern Steppes are actually not like a wasteland. A lot of people think they are. They're not. It's noted as a big grassland with little spots of forest. So presumably there are quite a lot of creatures that live out there. And typically, the further north you go, a lot bigger and spookier a lot of the creatures get. So the things that live out there might require large groups of wolves to kill, along with bolt throwers. Hobgoblins are known for their bolt throwers, and like pulled around on chariots and stuff. So you got to think about what are they using those against, and it could be the answer is the things that they eat. But they're also facing off against, the various tribes of chaos. There are a lot of marauder tribes up there. Every once in a while, a chaos horde will pop down. If they kill them, they've got no problem eating people. No problem at all whatsoever.
So I'm going to kind of quote someone that I was discussing this with all the way back in around about 2003, I think. But then, no, 2004. And I'm not going to name them because I think it's unfair to name them when they're not here to defend themselves. But they were, I would argue, the person who created Warhammer. And I sat down and I said, for example, one question. Why are there no port cities in the north of the Empire? It makes no sense. His answer was, it looked rubbish on the map. And we wanted all the center to be in the set, all the focus to be in the center. And that's why Altdorf's in the middle. And I was like, okay, right, fair enough. Weird. But he's like, I don't care about that in the slightest. I was just making a world for armies to beat living crap out of each other. We don't care about trade routes and everything. The roleplay game does that. And somewhat similarly, this, because I was asking about Warhammer cities and how Altdorf, which he wanted to be effectively the Rome of the Warhammer world, as in it was the core city in the old world. And I was attempting to make sense of it all for the roleplay game, because the roleplay game requires sense. And I said, the roleplay game said it's got like 15,000 people there. What the heck? I mean, that's not a great Rome. And he was like, yeah, no, that's wrong. And I regret that they could ever do that. I regret how this was done, that was done. It's meant to be like Rome. And then I was coming, how can it even exist? He's like, shut up. I'm doing stuff for armies here. Literally. This is for armies. This doesn't matter. We want great armies going to war. We want the great stories, the great imagery. The world building is less important than the awesomeness of it all. It was a different form of world building that they were going for, where the roleplay game went for the detail. So for the fantasy battle side of things, that sort of detail just doesn't matter to the creators, or at least to that creator. They were not interested in the slightest. They left that for others to worry about when they were writing stories or trying to make sense of it all in the roleplay game. Sadly, that was me, because then in the roleplay game, I had to go and make sense of this sort of thing, because I had to say, this is how it all works. And this sort of question was the sort of thing that was debated behind the scenes when we attempted to write the roleplay bits. How can you have Altdorf with 1 million people when it's surrounded by forests and no farmlands? How can we make this work? And this is exactly this sort of question. How can you have nomads, these great nomadic tribes that number in tens of thousands, spreading across this area and still feed all these ravening wolves that don't eat the grass? How does this even frickin' work? And the answer to this one is, it actually doesn't. So we have to come in and start filling the gaps. That is what we do. And when we're doing these streams, for example, we do. And the answer that Sotek provides is a great one. The answer is that these are close to the chaos waste. There's all sorts of big entities. There's almost certainly great hordes of creatures, monsters, things, massive things that the wolves eat, that they chase down. There's going to be an enormous number of them, much like the buffalo used to exist over in the northern plains of America. There'll be equivalents over here on the eastern steppe. We don't know what they are yet because no one's come along to discuss them. But they have to exist, because beneath it all, for all the original creators of some parts of the world may not have cared about it beyond, this makes the best, coolest place for us to have our armies, and it looks fucking awesome. When someone comes in to detail it, they will answer it. And the answer here is obvious. There's meat. There's a lot of meat.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, there is a genuine charm, in my opinion, that the OG creators of Warhammer have the attitude of someone being like, well, what about this like economical question? They're like, shut up, nerd. Roll dice. Shut up.
That's not cool.
Warrington Crescent. The control the Khanate has over the steppes could explain why they're seen as untrustworthy. They're not a single nation. Agreements with one tribe wouldn't carry to another tribe. However, they are unified. So most countries, not fully understanding that, would see it as treachery instead of the group you hadn't paid off attacking things in their territory.
So I agree with that entirely, Mornington Crescent, but I'll also add that I think a core component of the Hobgoblin psyche is also treachery, but they are also cowardly as a group, which means that they do not attack from the front if they can avoid it. The second you turn your back, you're going to get stabbed if they see any potential advantage at all, which means that for all treachery as a core component of them, they're also extremely reliable. Extremely. Because you know how they're going to act. They are always going to try to take the best out of any situation. So if you come in completely prepared for this and aware that they will betray you, then there's no betrayal. There's nothing more than paying the correct fees to get from A to B to C to D. And the job then is trying to get through all of that mess without being killed. And I think your point is absolutely accurate, but I also think that it's more than that alone.
Yeah, there's actually, to Andy's point, there's a Talayan character both in the 2nd edition Bestiary and the 4th edition Tribulations who basically says the same thing. If you go into it expecting them to betray you and they know that you know they're going to betray you, they won't betray you because they know. So they won't do it. So they're actually very reliable in that circumstance. But you have to operate with that in mind.
There's a reason that the Chaos Dwarves absolutely subjugate them, and it's said in every edition consistently, and that's that the Hobgoblins make exceedingly good slaves because they are servile by nature. They do what they're told, but the very second you give them the slight chance, and it has to be a real chance, of getting out of their situation, they will take it if they think it can succeed. And they're greenskins, so they will take an opportunity if you present it. You give them an open back, they'll stab it because that's how they work. But you just don't give them those opportunities. The Chaos Dwarfs have them thoroughly underneath their collective chaotic thumbs, and thus they have an extremely reliable group of greenskins who they use to subjugate the other greenskins. So why does this all work? Because they are intelligent. They have a capacity to reflect upon their actions and whether they will succeed or fail. Other greenskins don't have this. They just look at a thing that's in front of them and act. The Hobgoblins think, this might not work. I'm not doing this. Where their great fear comes from. They only gain confidence when they're in a position of surprise. That is when they shine.
That's honestly, I think, the most brilliant thing about like the Khanate as a nation, essentially, or a realm, is the idea that you would think that many Hobgoblins all together roving around as all these different tribes that for hundreds of years have now been a actual united force, surely they would fall apart. Like they would constantly be backstabbing each other and collapsing in on itself, but they don't. And it's because they understand one another and they have a system where, despite the fact that they are by definition the most treacherous, they are also the most reliable.
Yeah, which is a really odd way to think, given just how generally they're perceived as the most evil of all the greenskin species, the goblinoids as they used to be called, because they are utterly merciless and self-centered. And that is true. Orcs are oddly reliable. Goblins are oddly reliable in how they work, where because of their ability to have foresight in many respects, deep thinking in some regards, they are unreliable. They will be thoroughly on your side forever until they're just suddenly not, because that opportunity has arisen, one perhaps of their own making. And I think that there is one other aspect to Hobgoblins that we should consider here. If they have such an ability to deeply reflect and consider the ramifications of their actions, they are sniveling, horrendous, terrible little creatures who have this capacity for thought, then that thought will manifest in other different ways. Humanity, for example, as we're seen as a species, we have this great capacity for thought and reflection, which we turn it into things like art. every species has their own versions of art, whether it may be crude songs or whether it's effigies to their gods or whatever. It suggests that the hobgoblins would have, of all the greenskin species, the greatest repository of art, because they themselves are thinkers in a way that the other greenskins aren't. They're not just simply attempting to praise their gods or fashion a simple weapon. They've got something else going on. So that suggests that if we were ever to detail them as a broader civilization, there's a lot of areas we could go to build something uniquely hobgoblin in terms of a greenskin society, because they've got a different mental outlook to the rest of the greenskins.
Yeah, something to reinforce that last little thing that Andy said, just to reinforce that, to make it clear to people that aren't super familiar with regular greenskins about what makes the hobgoblin so fascinating, is that if you deal with a regular goblin, if a regular goblin has the opportunity to backstab a fellow goblin, he's not going to think about the consequences. He's just going to do it. That's what animosity is all about. The Legion of Starscreams. Exactly.
That one.
Yeah, there's no Megatron. It's just Starscreams.
For those of you who are Transformer fans, that's perfect. They're all Starscreams, every last one of them.
But something you'll see a lot, in just constant reinforcement in orc and goblin stuff, is that goblins and orcs do not think of the consequences. They don't think ahead. A goblin, if there's an opportunity to kick somebody while they're down or backstab a fellow, they're going to do it. We're not thinking about how it might be a problem. Orcs, if something challenges them or they have the ability to bully something, they're gonna fight. They're not going to think about it. Hobgoblins think about the consequences. They think ahead. They won't go for it if they think that it could possibly come back onto them.
Yeah, look at their clever treacherousness that brought about the downfall of the uprising of the slaves during the entire Chaos Dwarf mess. They purposefully timed a betrayal of the Greenskins, all of them, at the right time, and they did it as a group. And they betrayed the entirety of the Greenskins, switched sides, and brought the slave revolt to an end, guaranteeing them a better position within the slavery uprising. Now, the alternative would have been that they stuck with the Greenskins, the whole thing would have collapsed, and the Greenskins would have bullied them into submission. So instead, they went, nah, fuck it, we're going to get the Chaos Dwarves to be our best mates. And they secured themselves a better position through doing so. It was a calculated maneuver. Now, the idea that that single calculated maneuver somehow ingrains itself into all Greenskins from that step forward is clearly nonsense. It's a lovely story, and I'm quite convinced that inside, for example, the Chaos Dwarf slave pens, it's exactly the story that they all believe. They would 100% believe that. The Hobgoblins suck. They suck hard because they're the ones who are subjugating the Greenskins again and again and again. But in terms of the overall orcdom, goblinoid kingdoms or whatever, they just wouldn't care at all. So clearly there's something a bit deeper going on.
Yep. Darius Rose, should I be concerned if my smile looks identical to Gorda's backstabber? Yes, you should, because your mouth should not be smiling that wide. Please see a doctor.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
If you've got a full face half moon grin, please see a doctor. Ricky Chapman. We made a shield out of a hobgoblin backbone plate during a Wolfram game. We left it in a great Taurus's mouth and ran while it was choking on it. As you do.
Love it.
That's a great use of all of those things. Good job. Darius Rose. How does the Khanate deal with the Warriors of Chaos and Chaos invasions? How is the Khanate kept together in spite of living so far north? So, great question. So this is actually directly addressed in Tamarkan. Where Tamarkan, as you're reading through the big story, there's a section where it talks about when he arrives on the eastern steppes, and he's working his way down towards the eastern side of the Mountains of Morn, also known as the Ancient Giant Lands. And what it talks about is that the Khanate initially genuinely considers challenging him, which if you think about how fucking huge Tamarkan's horde is at this point, because he hasn't suffered all the attrition. He's at like full power, and the Khanate looks at him and thinks about it because they're that goddamn strong, and they decide, nah, it's not our fight, and they just move out of the way, which is one of their best advantages and allows them to be so annoying to Chaos. Is that if they see a Chaos horde that they decide, they're not going to take them on head on, they never do, but if they're not going to harass them and use really clever tactics, then they just move out of the way. That is how they've survived for many, many, many thousands of years. And it makes them really fucking good at what they do. One of the things I really love that talks about the Great Bastion is we look at the Great Bastion, we go, oh, well, clearly Cathay never has any problems from the north, except for like the rare time, like, you know, a hole gets ripped in the wall by an earthquake or something. And that's not true. The Hobgoblin Khanate has gotten around the wall. It talks about that the wall is so big, Cathay can't defend all of it simultaneously, and the Hobgoblins keep eyes on it. And if they see a section that doesn't look like it's being guarded well enough, they just use greenskin shenanigans to scale parts of the wall, climb over it, raid the lands, and then run back and jump back over and leave. Because they're just annoying little shits.
So, Darius, the easiest answer is they are a mobile community, and they can engage or not engage where they wish, and they are broadly mostly using giant wolves to be a part of their movement options, and they're fast, far faster than horses, meaning that the heavily armored Chaos Warriors et al. Just are too slow for them. They can just go. It's not easily pinned down. Unlike the vast majority of civilizations where you've got yourself a core position you can always attack, a capital or something similar, a great conglomerate, something where everything is built, consumed, used, and things are made. They don't have that. They're constantly on the move. So the answer is they just go.
Yep. Adam, maybe Hobgoblins are the equivalent of Goblin Black Orcs, goblins that Chaos Dwarfs made that spread to the wider world. Could be.
I don't think so, because they predate Chaos Dwarfs as a concept. So I think that if we are going into mad theory land, they are exactly that, as in they are an equivalent to Black Orcs. They appear to be something that is different to everything else, and so much so that all the other greenskins are appalled by what they represent.
Somebody messed with treacherous.
And that being the case, I think there are only two potential answers for where they probably come from.
Mm-hmm.
But we can get to that in the end as a crazy, summation or something.
Shouldn't be that hard of a guess if you've been showing up to any of our streams, though.
It won't be hard at all. Although I will offer one deeply controversial option.
Oh, that'll be fun.
It's always good to offer a
would you rather push your trust in a Skaven or a Hobgoblin?
Skaven.
Preferably, that's interesting. I would have said Hobgoblin.
So trust. Trust is the important word. Trust Skaven. Skaven are basically a hobgoblin, and its nature is like Skaven on steroids. They're much, much less trustworthy. They're much more likely to betray. And if they see any potential of self-serving ways out of it, they will. Skaven are kind of like that too, but they don't take it to the same ridiculous degree. Skaven are more trustworthy in some respects because they are more normally attracted to their self-serving ways. But they are in many respects, just take a look at their society as a whole, they fit within whatever norms that they're in for their entire relatively short lives. They're constantly backbiting and scrabbling, but they're quite cowardly as a notion, where the hobgoblins, it's written into their DNA in a way that makes the Skaven and their almost societally driven version of individualism to be, I think, quite trainable out. Skaven would make, for example, far better slaves because you could train them and breed them in a particular way. Hobgoblins have it innately within them to be treacherous. Skaven are just animals, just like humans are just animals. They could be anything if brought up in a society or brought up in a community in a particular way. Our community, as in real humans in the real world, we're all brought up to act in a generally, the vast majority of the world these days sticks to a relatively Abrahamic 10 Commandments way of living one's life, even when they're deeply atheist or deeply following one religion or another, particularly over here in the West, where thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not do all these things. We have this innate guilt built into us from an early youth. Our basic morals are sort of sat there. We're given a universal grounding with those in our societies, but some societies go to different extremes at different points. But we're societally driven, except for our innate drives. Our Skaven innate drive is kind of self-serving, with hobgoblins 100% self-serving. So I would go Skaven, but it's a fine sliver.
Yeah, what's funny is what I would say is that trust obviously is silly. The answer is truly neither. But I would say that, like, if my goal was like I was in an enclosure and I had to like deal with one of them, I would feel more confident about dealing with and trying to predict the Hobgoblin than I would the Skaven. But I feel like if I was like, I have to live a life with them, I would choose the Skaven because they're easier to manipulate.
Yeah, you got to remember that with the Skaven, there's always something you can never predict, and that's the fact that they have a god that is always looking out for them or is always tainting them from within. So no matter what you do, the Horned Rat's always going to be twisting them from inside. And the same way that the Hobgoblins, they're going Mork and Gork, right? Right? Maybe?
Maybe. Captain Magma, is it possible the old ones made greenskins to set in motion the eventual rise of Sigmar, since Age of Sigmar was the plan all along? A big part of Sigmar's story is, especially early on, is greenskins.
Sure.
I mean, I feel like that kind of falls into that, like, that's enough meta context that I don't think there's a way to realistically argue against it. So it's like, sure, why not? It could.
It could. I mean, if you run with the whole thing's part of the great plan, then they don't even need to make the greenskins. They just need to know the greenskins are there doing the thing that the greenskins do, and they eventually have these outcomes. So the greenskins stowed away was nothing more than they purposely brought the greenskins, or at least a faction of them did, allowing them to be sown, allowing for certain events to occur because they were there. So the answer is, whenever it comes to something that's predetermined with predestiny, yeah, sure. And the old ones are always in that yeah, sure.
Yeah, what I will say is that's not my preferred version. I could say that for sure.
Yeah, and my preferred version, the greenskins are absolutely not an old one creation. They are either an element of chaos, small c, added to the mix that they did not intend, or alternatively, a faction of greenskins and old ones absolutely wished it to happen, where another faction did not.
Yeah, that's super fair. Photep, how could one explain half orcs with the whole fungus background, or rather, what's the half part referring?
Right, so I can give several answers in this one that are really short. Number one, they don't exist. This is the line I have been given multiple times by Games Workshop. They just don't exist. Half orcs are old Warhammer in the same way that pygmies are old Warhammer. They're a thing that we wish we hadn't done, and they shouldn't be that way. But you go to Black Library and suddenly there's a whole bunch of half somethings popping up in this novel or that novel. And then you go to the announcement threads that popped up in the Warhammer community for Warhammer the Old World. And in there, they referenced half orcs. So clearly those old forms are popping up again every once in a while. And we are left, if we take in the entirety of the background, asking, where can they come from? If orcs are fungus, the answer is they can't come from them. They just can't, because biologically they are so fundamentally different. They're not going to have orcs coming over, mixing with humans and creating half orcs, which means that they must come from one of the other, in heavy quotation marks, goblinoid species. The most obvious choice would be something like hobgoblins, because they're not like other greenskins. And we've got an option for perhaps having a greenskin species that's completely different to the others. Another one would be a different goblinoid species, or alternatively, the classic answer that's often brought up whenever Games Workshop goes, we wish we hadn't done that. It's a mutation. In that something went wrong with chaos and chaos allowed it to occur. And that is the answer that's given for some of the more famous Black Library options where a half-elf it happens. And that was, they had sex and they had a kid, and it should never have happened. It just shouldn't, but it did. And chaos was responsible because of the flushing of the winds of magic or some other nonsense or a spell or something else crazy. And then we get ourselves an outcome that's unexpected, because whenever you say something can't happen in the Warhammer world, there is always an example of where it did, because the Warhammer world is full of chaos.
There's always
and craziness. Exactly.
Asshole author who's going to be like,
I'll make this work. So the answer to this is, if you just stick with the basics of what each thing is at its fundamental level, it's impossible for it to occur. But I'm sure that with a clever bit of writing, you could make it happen in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, and the original half-orcs were half-human, half-orc. The original.
Yeah, they were.
I don't know if that's what they would still be if they brought them back. I mean, maybe they could play it clever and they're half something really weird. But we'll see.
One of the issues is that one of the mistakes that people who are reading Warhammer make is thinking that there is a one overarching mind creating everything. There isn't. Each writer that comes along has their own prejudices. Some writers come into Warhammer writing going, I think orcs should have women. I just think they should. Half orcs are cool, and they write it. Then the next writer comes along and goes, no, they're fungus. That's what they are. That's what they are. Half orcs can't happen. So you'll find that the reason we have so many different conflicting versions is different writers have different preferences. And as Games Workshop goes through its cycles of people who control it, each person who is in control of making those decisions also changes and has different opinions. So 1 year, you might have somebody saying half orcs is great. Then literally the next year, they're like, see that thing you wrote, remove it, never mention it again. That's not Games Workshop. And then you get some really weird people who sit out in the periphery without anyone giving them any real oversight, who then write something totally out of it that Games Workshop then look at and go, how the hell do we incorporate that? We should never have let that happen. And they either ignore it, so fans are just left going, well, that still stands, doesn't it? Or they try to overwrite it in a way that's often clumsy. So there is no great overarching voice here. There is no individual with all of the yes or no on this who will be consistent. So we're constantly going to have this sort of thing pop up, which is why the answer is always going to be us saying something like, all those things can't happen except with chaos they can.
Yeah. Just as a fun reminder to everyone of GW's inconsistencies, keep in mind that when they announced the old world, they showed art and were very happy and proud to announce that the first playable race would be Kislev. And yet here we are in old world with no Kislev. So
yeah, we'll be lucky if we get them at the start of second edition.
Yep. Serpenza, in your opinions, how do you add those forgotten cultures without severe retcons? Is it possible?
Yeah.
Like for today's topic, could be the Kazakh, Oghuz, Uzbek, etc. cultures added, not all Hobgoblins per se. I would say it's very possible.
Yeah, it's not just possible, it's super easy, barely an inconvenience. I'll take a single example of that in the past. When I was tasked with rewriting Kislev and bringing it up to date for Realm of the Ice Queen, all the way back in like 2010 or something like that. The initial pitch was, it's just Kislev. There is no Gospodars, there is no Ungals. And my initial pitch back was, I would like to have a multicultural society that has at least internally 5 different cultures. I want at least 2 of them to be PC options. I want it to be an interesting, multifaceted place that speaks to the potential of what the Norse do to them and all the rest. And then it becomes a bit of to and fro. And ultimately, that's what we landed in. We've got Ropsman mentioned in there, Vikings mentioned in there. We've got a whole bunch of other things mentioned. There's lots of older tribes that have been wiped out. We've got the idea of different Stanistas with different facings. All of that's there. And yes, that gets simplified by Games Workshop whenever they do another thing later. But yes, it can be added and it's not hard. And all of that was done not by going, hey, let's look at all the existing lore and make it definitely match that perfectly, although I did. In some degrees, I actually ignored parts of it, like I didn't include the Scythians, which were just a real-world uplift and drop from real-world Scythians that they had done in a very clumsy way. So I didn't include those, although they are kind of hinted at in one of the chapters. So all of this is super easy. It just requires a writer who is adept and dexterous enough to think about the place in more than just one note. So if, for example, we were going up and detailing all of the area of the Eastern Steppe, so to speak, you wouldn't just be looking at Hobgoblins. You would be looking at all of the existing peoples there, the Chaos tribes that sit beside them, the various human other tribes, perhaps another species entirely, maybe some sort of centaur-driven wandering tribe that's wandering around there that are beyond simply centaurs, for example. That's what the Scythians were originally based on. If you don't know, Games Workshop wrote at one point that the winged lancers were based on centaurs. It was a crazy idea. Kislev's winged lancers were actually originally centaurs and not even human, which is a bit mental, kind of fun though. Yeah, indeed. There's lots of crazy stories out there, but it's easy to take all of those ideas that already exist within the real world cultures and then make Warhammer equivalents if you want. But you, generally speaking, don't want to just do uplift, copy, paste because it's Warhammer. It's not the real world. But the real world provides a wealth of really cool details that you can at least refer to, speak to, use in fun ways, particularly if you can get people from those areas to engage and talk with, because they'll know stuff that you don't.
What I was going to say is that I think that's why I think Andy would agree with this. One of my biggest dreams and hopes for GW will always be that they will aggressively try to hire writers from different parts of the world. Like really try and get out of their comfort bubble and try and get writers from Africa and South America and the US and Canada and like different cultures other than just being a bunch of British folks.
Yeah, and I'd like to say, because there's often a pushback against this, saying, well, surely the best person for the job should get it, not someone from elsewhere. You don't understand. The best person for the job is someone from elsewhere. And the reason for that is they can add cultural details and knowledge that the person who is writing from the outside will never get, because they're not written down in a handy Wikipedia article. They're not written down in the basic book of the area. They're passed on culturally, person to person. I know stories about the north of Scotland that aren't in any book because I come from there. I have moved around all the caves up there. I've heard about a whole bunch of crazy local ghosts and craziness that no one else will have, because they didn't get brought up there. So if anyone's writing a book about that sort of thing from up there, I am going to be a better source than the Book of Scottish Legends, which is what you're going to do if, for example, you're a British or American writer writing about, for example, the Book of Mongolian Legends. You're just going to end up with nothing more than salient top points rather than the depth and coolness of what that particular culture can offer. So broadly speaking, at the very least, you need someone from there to be advising you what to write. But that's not really an answer to this question.
Yeah, but yes, we did answer that question. So now we shall carry on. Jim Miller, a little behind, but is English education why North America is Nagaroth? Or we Dark Elves? No, we've talked about this. Dark Elves?
No, Nagaroth is in no way a reflection of North America.
Now, I will say, there are a hilarious amount of eerie similarities, but it was not the intent.
Yeah, absolutely. No. The Dark Elves, as they have been created, were not created as a representation of what North America is. They were created as what would have happened with those Dark Elves when they moved there and did what they did. And the species they were attempting to create, which was kind of like just ripping off Michael Moorcock's Melnibonians and popping them up there. It's not as deep as you think it is. Now, can we take the High Elves and make a lovely description of post-colonialism from the High Elves' perspective? Yes, because the High Elves draw a lot from, of all things, UK history. They are far more like the British than they are most other groups out there. And then looking at Nagaroth as, well, this is what happens when the Brits went over there and started using slavery. Sure, you can do that, but that wasn't the intention.
No, but there are things that you may find of interest that could reinforce stories being told over there.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome Lion Suarez. Thanks for the answer. That's fair. Hoping GW decides to do in Koresh Araby one day so we can have them until War 3. Super unlikely. Yeah, I am also on Hopium, and I will be till the day I die. Wasn't there a bit of old lore that talked about chaos orcs, or was that from 40k? If I recall correctly, normal greenskins considered them almost a heretical thought and hated them even more than they dislike hobgoblins, which would speak against hobgoblins having a chaos origin.
Chaos was a core component of all species in the first 3 editions of Warhammer, in that you would have chaos versions of all species. And this almost translated over into the 4th edition as well. In fact, if you look at the Dark Elf army list, the version that's presented there on the cover has a coordinate symbol on it for the Witch Elf, as I recall. That might be, however,
a symbol on her helmet.
Yeah, totally. And that's just not what the book describes, because there was still a holdout for that amongst the various creatives who were behind the scenes, in that chaos was a core component of all species, and that is no more clearly defined. And then if you go back to the old Realms of Chaos books, Realm of Chaos 1 and 2, Lost in the Damned, and Slave to Darkness. So those 2 books give you Chaos Orcs, Chaos Hobgoblins, Chaos literally everything. But that kind of goes down by the wayside, and truly speaking, we're really only left with Chaos Dwarfs and Chaos Humans, lots of them, the very occasional Chaos Elf. That's about it. All the other species are left to their individual factions and not really used beyond that. If we were looking at the multifaceted nature of the Warhammer world, there probably would still be Chaos Greenskins here or there, but I think it would be very extreme, not the far more open. There's a whole tribe of them that are corn worshippers up there, largely because of the unique connection that Mork and Gork have with all orcs and greenskins. The very way that greenskins work is working through Mork and Gork. They're building up of the Y energy. It's so fundamentally different to chaos that it requires some form of extreme for it to ever occur. So I'm happy with it not being in any army list, and I'm also happy with it being an exceedingly rare extreme example. But having said that, though, I'm also happy with it existing, because chaos can get into anything.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, just think about, like, think about what Azhag is and how weird Azhag the Slaughterer is and everything he represents. You could have a chaos version of that without stretching anything very hard. Lidor, I could unironically see Hobgoblins and Skaven working relatively good together. Both cultures' expressions of traitorous and self-centered behavior, why expressed differently, could also give them some outlook of the world.
Agreed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there could be some really good stories told about the Skaven that live, because there would be Skaven clans up in the Eastern Steppes.
Yep.
There just are, period.
Yeah, some of the many sub-clans of Clan Eshin over there, they're almost certainly working with Hobgoblins at various points. Unlike, though, most of the species that the Skaven work with, there's nothing to undermine here. There's no great cities for them to get under, which means that the only way to really deal with this great force that's above land is to deal with it. They can't undermine it. They can't eat at its roots because it doesn't put down roots. So in some respects, it's fundamentally different to the Skaven, which means if they want to communicate with and work with, they literally have to come up and communicate with and work with. And I think that makes it for a really fascinating dynamic, because normally the Skaven work by subtly whispering from within. They can't do that with the Hobgoblins.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting thing to consider that, like, the Hobgoblins, they're moving around. They have these great mobile platforms with like tents and all this crazy shit on them that are moving around with bolters and mobile platforms and just chariots and lots of cool shit. And the idea that the Skaven, especially if they still have like the Hobhounds, which whether or no those still exist is very up in the air right now, of being these almost large warg-like creatures. The idea that the Skaven, the Hobgoblin Khanate's kind of perfectly designed where the Skaven would really struggle to deal with them in any meaningful way, other than probably through mostly negotiation. They would kind of be a nightmare for the Skaven a lot of the time. But you imagine
potentially an exceedingly good ally.
Yeah. That's what I was about to say. Is that I mean, because one thing we've talked about, and this is something that gets muddy, especially because of what AOS has kind of done with them from a very distant viewpoint. If you read the actual lore, it stayed consistent. But the Skaven and Chaos do not get along. They are enemies far more often than they're allies. They butt heads a lot. Yeah. And the idea that that a lot of the times you don't tend to see the Chaos invasions come down from the Eastern Steppes because they tend to get waylaid and torn apart by a alliance of the Khanate and the Skaven is a genuinely interesting story.
I think so too.
And hopefully one that we'll see explored someday.
Yeah.
Rocker Boy, Juke Boys, in Guardians of the Forest, Leofric Karad is said to venture into Cathay to slay a Jade Dragon. How would you rework that now that Yuan Bo exists? So there's a lot of different ways you could do it. You could do it that he maybe gets into a big fight against a Shukengun that has a more draconic appearance, and he believes it's a dragon in human form. That's how they portray themselves. They talk about, I am literally Dragon Blood, and they get in a big shit fight, and he kills it. And he goes, whoop, I killed a Jade Dragon. Good job, me. And it could also be that it's just a literal Jade Dragon. Yuan Bo is not the only Jade Dragon in existence.
Yeah, there's multiple dragons over there. They're not the only dragons. There's lots of ways you could take it. And I think that Sotek's suggestion is probably one of the better ones, because then you could get a really interesting story. Although I would be interested in probably pitching that as Dragon-Blooded Shukugan, who can potentially even take on dragon form in a very short-term way or something similar, and attempt to take him out. I killed a dragon. That would work quite well too.
Yeah.
Or someone who's used magic to use. I mean, there's loads of ways to use magic to transform oneself into a dragon. And the idea that some of the dragon-blooded can't do that is actually crazy.
Yeah, I would be willing to bet a crazy amount of money plenty of the Shukuguns can transform using magic. Because transformation of Kaden can make you into a dragon. So
yeah, totally. I mean, it's ridiculous that some of them wouldn't be doing that in an almost battle where, I mean, every other battle they'd probably be doing it if they could. And I think some of them would.
Yep. Phil, what are your thoughts on the Total War Warhammer Hobgoblin redesign? Personally, I dislike the fact that they now have the pointed caps like Night Goblins rather than their classic curved Phrygian caps. Not only do they lack their distinct look, you'd want aerodynamic gear when you're running around all the time. Pointed cap would go against it. So I will say that I like the Wolf Riders because they have like the bronze lamellar armor, like they have the Khanate armor and look, and I like them. The ones on foot, I was not as big a fan of their redesign. I wish they had stuck a little bit closer to the art from the 5th edition army book. to give them to have them, because I agree that when you look at them, they kind of look like night goblins. And I think it would have been nicer to keep that a little, like, if you zoom in, you're like, oh, they're different, but you shouldn't have to zoom in that much to tell they're different.
Yeah, I dislike it. And I dislike it purely because it loses unique, distinctive characteristics that ensure that the hobgoblins look different enough from the goblins, particularly when you're zoomed out in a game like Total War. A goblin and a hobgoblin, in terms of overall size, don't look hardly any different at all. Yes, sure, one of them is taller and sort of skinnier and more evil looking. Yeah, whatever. They look almost identical. So yeah, keeping our classic curved hats would, I think, have been one of the unique aspects of picturing them that I'd want. In the end, you always want to try and ensure that they have a unique silhouette, and even that rounding helps a bit, but it's not much. Losing that, I thought, was a shame.
I agree. Yep. Sir Panza, how big are hobgoblin wolves? A lot of people forget how big real wolves are. So giant wolves in fantasy tend to just be normal wolves. Giant wolves would be bear sized or bigger. So there is an interesting thing with the giant wolves, because you're right that the regular goblins of the old world ride giant wolves, that when you really look at them, it depends on how well. I will say it depends on
I'm going to override your comment here, Sir Panza. The giant wolves that they ride in Warhammer are so much bigger than real world wolves. Like so much. I have seen more real world wolves than I care to mention. And there is no wolf that's like up to here at its shoulder on me as I stand up, and I'm 6 foot tall. The giant wolf models are bigger than horses almost in terms of their overall size. They're huge.
So that there's a misconception that I totally get, because I've seen it, where sometimes you'll get artists that draw the giant wolves and they make them pretty small. And
Agreed.
You'll see like a goblin on a giant wolf is like the size of a man, and you're like, that's not very big. And that just happens sometimes. But the giant wolves are very consistently described as the size of full horses that big humans ride. Like,
look at the miniatures.
Fucking dogs.
Look at the miniatures. The miniatures are a better guide here.
Yeah, but the hobgoblin ones would probably, they'd be a different breed, so they'd probably look different. Maybe they'd be a little bigger. There's not a whole lot of details on it.
There's another big misconception here. The Mongols as a group rode horses that nowadays most people would refer to as ponies, because they were quite small in comparison to the larger war horses that were used in many parts of the West. And equally, many of the larger war horses that people expect were used by knights aren't as big as many people think they used to be. The horses were of a variety of different sizes doing different jobs. But
Warhammer has bad size envy when it comes to horses.
It really does. But when it comes to the wolves are pretty consistent outside of the art, and that's that they are a size of a horse, and that's how big they're supposed to be. But I will agree with one thing, though, that the real wolves are bigger than just many of the descriptions that are as big as many of the art pieces, because real wolves can be pretty damn big, but not as big as the horse-sized ones that are supposed to be the Wolf Rider standard.
Yeah, I will note a fun fact for those that are curious about the Hobgoblin Wolf Rider. Something I was doing some reading on. One of the things I found that I actually really liked is a lot of people wonder like about the difference between like Goblin Wolf Riders that come from primarily the Wolf Lands, which is the western edge of the Darklands, and then the Hobgoblin Wolf Riders, which are a little different. One of the things that I was reading about that I actually found very interesting, that once again talks about the hobgoblins in a really interesting light, is that the hobgoblins are noted to actually take very good care of their wolves compared to regular goblins, to the extent that they even groom them and keep them like tidy and clean, instead of being just disgusting, feral, emaciated beasts like you see with the goblins typically, which is interesting.
Goblin Beastmasters are horrible, where the Hobgoblin Beastmasters appear to treat their animals pretty well. And that in and of itself makes for a fascinating difference between them. The Hobgoblins are really not orky, goblin-y. They're just different.
Yeah, one of the things that's Hobgoblins, although they can be cruel, they're not noted as being nearly as torture-happy as regular goblins.
If you go with the description in 5th edition and you go with the description afterwards, they are described as more evil than the goblins frequently. They take out what they consider to be doled upon them by the Chaos Dwarves upon everyone else. They are worse slave masters than the Chaos Dwarves. So I would say that a part of their character appears to be exceptionally vindictive.
I feel like that's more the Chaos Dwarf Hobgoblins, though, not the Khanate Hobgoblins.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but I think that's possibly only fair because we've never really had a proper description of the Khanate ones. The Hobgoblins in general are always described as deeply treacherous and the most evil of the greenskins, as in small scale evil.
Yeah.
Not chaos as in worshipping naughty dark monsters from beyond, but most certainly horrible creatures who will do horrible things. But that in no way means that they won't necessarily look after their wolves well, because their animals in no way have an intelligence to come back on. But I reckon they would definitely kick a dog when it's down, because hobgoblins do not appear to be very nice things. That all said, the only example we have, our clear example of a hobgoblin doing this stuff, is again, what's his face? Gazak Khan. Yes, Gazak Khan. And Gazak Khan is a fully functioning hobgoblin in human society who has managed to not only have a chunk of wolf riders who are peacefully moving through Tilia, and then peacefully warring against the enemies of the Tilians they've been hired for, as in they work with other humans with ease. The animals are sticking beside them, doing whatever needs to be done, but they're doing that hand in hand with other greenskins. So there's orcs and goblins and more also peacefully working within that framework. So the hobgoblins quite clearly don't work in the same way as orcs and goblins as a whole, for all they are treacherous motherfuckers.
Yep. Fire Emblem here. I mean, as far as what the Mongols did, you could see why they would be seen as a monster. After all, the Mongols are responsible for the Black Plague.
I mean, you can see why they are beyond just that, simply because everything that was set against them, they destroyed pretty much. They swept through Europe with terrifying ease over through the east of Europe. And that is enough by itself, without any worries about the potential of various fleas that Black Plague and the rest of it that could have come. That alone was enough to turn them into the great terror from the east. So yeah, in the same way that Napoleon was quite literally equated as Satan by his enemies. They believed he was Satan. And particularly if you look at some of the stories that were escaping from Russia, UK, UK as it is now, and similar, it was Napoleon is the devil and has to be stopped by God. And there is no alternative, because he was similarly sweeping through Europe, doing whatever he was doing. It doesn't require anything more than being martially more powerful than your enemy to immediately pick up a bad name. And when you are whooping around on horseback doing things that other people consider to be uncivilized, it's very easy to turn you into nothing more than the barbarians that that the Romans like to refer to anyone that was outside of their borders, because they all sounded like they were going bar when they were talking. So yeah, they're all barbarians, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and there's that classic thing of like when someone fights using rules that you yourself don't use, you're like, oh, well, those guys are savages.
Savages, like, exactly.
Well, we're all killing each other, so I mean, but
yeah, quite.
Jonathan Scott, more logistics hammers with the people create. I mean, you joke, but honestly, logistics hammer is really fun. It's stupid, but it's really fun. I mean, I
genuinely agree, and it's one of the massive arguments that's set throughout, for example, the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay community, that's focused around what is the population of Altdorf, and trying to justify how you could feed 1 million souls in comparison to the much easier feeding of 15,000 souls is a core component of parts of those conversations. So yeah, logistics hammer, it's good fun.
Chris, if Hobgoblin magic is more than just Wa magic, theoretically, what other kind of magic could they use? Non-greenskin magic, maybe wind magic. So interestingly, you say that. There is a note that I particularly love. So Cubicle 7 has done the somewhat unenviable task of trying to explore the other incarnate elementals. So the elementals of the other winds of magic, because Monstrous Arcanum only gave us 3. And when they talked about the Wind of Light, they actually talk quite a bit about how a lot of people believe it is a wind spirit, because it's this really hard to see thing that can move really fast. And it's they talk about that the race that's actually the most familiar with it are some folks in Araby, but the Hobgoblins. that the Hobgoblin Khanate talk about wind demons that they have an interesting relationship with, that it exists up in the Eastern Steppes and is doing stuff up there. But the Hobgoblins do have a relationship with it, which could be an interesting type path to explore.
Yeah, I mean, at its very basics, if they're not using greenskin magic, then they are particularly close up on the steppe to the Northern Gate, which means that there is...
I mean, plenty of magic.
There's so much magic up there. And more magic there than there is, as much magic there, at least, as there is in Norska and similar. And we know just how much that has changed Norska from being what could be a relatively normal place into really not a normal place. Magic changes stuff. And the idea that none of the hobgoblins have been on the receiving end of this change seems silly. So, yes, the idea that their shamans and equivalents should be able to do something beyond greenskin magic is certainly within canon, and it would almost certainly involve the winds of magic. How that manifests has not really been explored. Should it be something separate to greenskins? And how they manifest their magic? I think so. Because it would make them more unique and more interesting if it was handled well. But I would be looking for something that uniquely spoke to how they live and their culture and where they are in terms of the overall world, rather than just simply going, oh, and they get, say, for example, access to amber magic, because that would be dull. It would be ultimately uninteresting. I would much rather do something unique, or something unique with the greenskin magic, and show how it manifests with hobgoblins differently. But I would be looking to reinforce the theme that hobgoblins are different to other greenskins, and fundamentally make other greenskins immediately respond with deep distrust in that what they're doing is wrong. They are treacherous individuals who are not worthy of their time and can never be trusted. And how does that best manifest? Through their magic. And that is where I would probably start in terms of the conversation, or trying to pin down a good answer to this.
Yes. 100% agree there. Ricky Scott, I'm late, but I'm starting from the top. See you guys in 2 hours. Have fun.
Have fun, Ricky.
We appreciate it, Ricky. Thank you for the support. Do hobgoblins worship Gorkamork? It's unclear.
That's a question.
It's unclear.
That is a question. So we have it partially kind of answered in an almost unofficial way, because it's been handled by a licensor. And that's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is always, in its current form, because it's not produced by Games Workshop, unofficial. And in the 4th edition, they've got clear access to the greenskin magic, which means that, yes, they do, if you go with that version of them. So yes, in that version, yes, but there's no discussion as to exactly how that works. So there's no long discussion about Mork and Gork or how that works. So the answer could be different to worship. It could be hobgoblins steal from Gork and Mork. They are treacherous with Gork and Mork. So there is more than one way we could approach this. So we can only say with any certainty that as far as a licensor is concerned, they are certainly attached to Gork and Mork, but we don't have an answer as to what that attachment is.
Darman, do you think Cathay probably deliberately tries to stir up battles between the Eastern Steppe Marauders, such as the Kurgan and the Hung, and the Hobgoblins, so they fight each other, such as Cathay?
Yes.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, a core component of the Shadow Wars that are going on around there would be trying to stir up problems between the various factions that can be found outside of their walls to ensure that their walls aren't assaulted. And I think that if one were to be writing a book about that area, you'd be looking at trying to build what all the core conflicts are, because the conflicts are the basis of all the good stories you're going to have. So the core conflicts between the different species that are there, whether that's hobgoblins, humans, Chaos Marauders, whatever else it might be, and then the individual factions amongst all of these species. So some Cathayans who perhaps want to bring down their realm, some hobgoblins who want to band together properly and bring about the great times of Kengai Khan, the one who first bound them all together, or Morkar Khan, who came before. Great hobgoblin names from the past who built massive empires. Okay, thinking about hobgoblins who want to do that, and think that Hobgoblin Khan's version, where he's quite happy just sitting there, controlling them when he needs to, but not actually building an empire per se, is unacceptable. So you start building factions for each of them, and then each of them working towards their own goals. Suddenly you get a ton of great stories.
Yeah, so I actually think that would be something we should talk about for a moment, because that's something that made me laugh, was when I was reading through the Hobgoblin stuff, that there seemed to be two, unless I am misunderstanding it, that, yeah, Gengai Khan and Morkar Khan seem to be the same guy. Or
they're
at least
not. They're definitely two. And there's a mistake there because there's just two different individuals that were laid down as first. As I recall, Kengai Khan is the first. And he was the first in terms of the first that was chronologically laid down as well by Games Workshop. As the first to bind all the trials together. And he's near mythological in terms of hobgoblins. And that it happened so long ago, he's nothing more than a name. He's the great Kengai Khan who bound them all together, where Morkar Khan was the first that made the empire. He was the first that actually built a proper empire of hobgoblins that lay to the north. And it was massive. And possibly Morkar Khan is the one who is responsible for the Cathayans building the wall. But none of that is certainly pinned down. It happened a long time ago as well.
In like Total War, I know they definitely fused them together.
Oh, that's interesting.
When you read the Gengai Khan landmark statue, it talks about how he's the founder of the Hobgoblin Khanate Empire.
Interesting.
But Gengai Khan, for anyone that is curious, that is like the big one. Like he is the big Khan.
And he was the first Hobgoblin Khan.
Yes.
And he is, and all the other Hobgoblin Khans that follow, basically the biggest warlord is the one who can claim to be Hobgoblin Khan. He is basically the top Khan, Hobgoblin Khan. And current Hobgoblin Khan, his name is almost certainly not Hobgoblin Khan. Hobgoblin Khan's his title. It's a little bit like saying the Emperor, but never naming the Emperor. So obviously Karl Franz has a name. Hobgoblin Khan probably has a name as well. What it is, the gods alone know. It's very possible that when they eventually come around to writing it, they'll forget that and his name will just be Hobgoblin Khan.
Yeah, so Genkai Khan, super cool hobgoblin that somehow managed to bind together all the different hobgoblin tribes, which is genuinely impressive. Rode a big, horrifyingly scary super wolf called Wolfang, whose pelt is a magic item that exists for the hobgoblins. That is super funny because I think it has like a curse where if you turn your back on the person wearing it, you die like instantly or some silly nonsense. But
welcome to Hobgoblin writing. All Hobgoblin writing tends to be pretty much that.
Yeah. But all right, moving on. Skylar Martin, have y'all seen the Fleshhound of Khorne 3D printed? That's no. Oh yes, no.
You're doing the baby.
I have seen all the stuff about Mutang. I have seen all the stuff about Mutang being a Khornate creature. I have not seen the 3D printed version yet, though. That sounds amazing.
Oh, I've not seen that either. Thanks, Skylar. I might look that up after.
Yeah, please put that on like our
Discord. Discord. That'd be amazing.
Alaflux, hey, thanks so much for the super chat.
Yeah, great to see you.
Phil, have you lads seen the concept art of Captain Skabend and Vorgaz Ironjaw for the Total War Mobile game that never came out? What are your thoughts about those characters? I haven't seen that. That's I don't even know who Skabend is off the top of my head. I know who Vorgaz is. Hold on, let me do a quick Google flu here.
This is one
Captain Skabend.
We just typed that one in as well.
A goblin pirate captain from 6th edition. White Dwarf.
Oh, I painted that miniature. I'd forgotten about it. I painted that miniature.
It's just a goofy little goblin pirate.
Yeah, go figure.
That would be a weird character.
I've seen the concept art. So, Phil, if you've got access to that concept art as a link somewhere, if you could pop that up in Discord, that'd be amazing. Particularly over in my Discord, because I'll never look over in Sotek, I always forget.
Yeah,
you put that in the Lorehammer Discord, that'd be great.
Yeah, please send us that. I think we'd like to very much see that.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see that.
I mean, Vorgaz, yeah, sure. I mean, I'd rather have Gorbad Ironjaw. Vorgaz just kind of shows up and gets killed. So it's like, whatever. Dynaman, so the Chaos Dwarfs hire the Hobgoblins for the Khanate as wolf riders, but would the Ogres also hire them as well? Yes, 100%. Yep.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the if, for example, we had an equivalent of the old 2nd and 3rd edition Forces of Fantasy, Ravening Hordes, Armies of Warhammer, or equivalent, all of which had a bunch of mercenary bands at the back, which were available to hire for most of the core armies, and they had a small amount of miniatures released for each of those. The Hobgoblins would be there, and the Hobgoblins would 100% be open to Ogres. They're not just natural allies, they are 100% natural allies. There would be ogres working with the hobgoblins, and there'll be hobgoblins working with the ogres. Indeed, there's going to be ogre tribes up on the steppe as well, almost certainly. One or two of them wandering around in a relatively nomadic way as well, probably eating any hobgoblins they can get their hands on. So yes, this is definitely a thing that should probably occur.
Yeah, I would going with what Andy said earlier. If you were working just for funsies, if you were working on what kind of cultures are up in the eastern steppes, in this land dominated by these interesting species, I think the triumvirate that would be very fun to work with and explore would be your ogre kingdoms, your Skaven, and your hobgoblin khanate. I think those would be the three dominant forces in the eastern steppes, outside, of course, of like your chaos tribes and stuff. But you could have but those three, I think, would work together in a really fun way because they're all very neutral-ish, and are prone to mercenary antics and backstabbing antics. So you could have a lot of really fun stories of those three factions working against and with each other.
Yep, totes.
Donman, do you think any hobgoblins have been into northern Nagaroth?
Yes.
Overland, yeah, for sure.
And I think it's almost certain that see, one of the great mistakes that many people make is thinking that the good old Khanate in the real world never went to sea, but it did. This whole divine wind in Japan was about, wasn't it? Destroying them all. Go play a little bit of the old Ghost of Tsushima to see just how much the Mongols were kicking around over there, and get a good example of that. So hobgoblins on boats, absolutely. Nasty stories of hobgoblins getting murdered by their million by divine winds that went on boats. I think that almost certainly should be part of the history as well. So yeah, it should be part of Cathayan history, Nipponese history, and Northern Nagaroth, and the peoples of Northern Nagaroth as well, because the Warhammer world has something that the real world doesn't have, and that's magic. And that means that no matter how improbable a thing may look on paper, it can be done because magic can always be brought to the bear. And once the hobgoblin magic is definitively marked down, we can then have almost certainly what would happen over to the far west of what is the equivalent of Nagaroth. So yeah, definitely think there should be a connection there.
Getting from the eastern steppe to Nagaroth using the Chaos Waste isn't really that far of a journey.
No, it's not.
It's pretty short, actually.
It is.
Hagen, of course, the hobgoblins treat their mounts well. They're smart enough to understand that they righted them should their mount fail to get left behind. Once again, that could go into the whole hobgoblins have a concept of consequences. Of if their mounts aren't well taken care of, then they're fucked.
So I think that's something that I would definitely write into them if I were doing it. And that's that the hobgoblins have a far greater idea of their position in the world. They think ahead, and a part of their planning is where they're going to go next with their wolves and everything else. And yes, they absolutely treat what is ultimately their safety well. It's a piece of equipment in some respects. It's the only thing that keeps them ahead of the chaos hordes. It's the only thing that keeps them ahead of the fucking dragons that are coming from the south. They need to move swiftly at the drop of a Phrygian hat, and they can't do that if their mounts literally are backing away, not wanting to be used, don't like them. They need to have mounts that do the opposite, work with them, work in sympathy with them, which means that they almost certainly are either A, using magic, or B, do the more sensible, easy thing, treat them well.
Yep. Hammond, what do you call a one-legged greenskin? A hobgoblin.
Hobgoblin. Trying to retain his king as the pun master, since he was challenged earlier in the stream.
Gengai Khan might not be able to sing, but Morcar Khan. There we go. There we go. It kills Dumbledore. How fucking could you? How could you do this? It's only been 20 years or whatever the fuck it's been now since that book came out. Diamond, Scottish rep for Andy. Edinburgh Zoo now has its own pygmy hippo called Haggis.
And more traumatically has recently lost a red panda kit, which is very sad, that died, complications, and possibly because of fireworks going boom, boom, boom outside. And it's been very, very sad over at Edinburgh Zoo. Just the idea that a red panda could die, like, little red pandas are so cute. But yeah, sadly.
Oh, yeah, that is a really nice concept art of those characters. I haven't seen those before. That's nice.
I was just looking at that too. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Okay, finally caught up on all those. Thank you all very, very much. So, one of the things that I also think is worth kind of talking about a little bit that we haven't really had time to hit on just because we were hopping around those conversations. One of the things that I find super fascinating when you're dealing with the Khanate as a nation, empire, whatever you want to call it, is that to be clear for anyone that's kind of listening and it hasn't and didn't catch it when we kind of talked a little bit about Genkai and stuff, the Hobgoblins have been a relatively united nation for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Thousands. Like, they're older than the Empire of Sigmar. They're old. They're real old. And one of the things that is particularly interesting about that is when you look at normal greenskin culture is normally divvied up into, you have your tribes, and they tend to fight one another like crazy until eventually one of them will get a boss that's big enough that he starts wailing on everybody else to the point that he can get a wall going, and then it builds up momentum and it kind of sucks everybody in, kind of like a flood, and then they slam into something. And it either wins, it keeps going, or it peters out. The really fascinating thing that is so bizarre, but I love about the Hobgoblins, is the idea that the Khanate has an understanding of that sticking together, despite the fact that they do have a culture of backstabbing. There's notes about that the Hobgoblins find assassination attempts and poisonings and all that stuff to be normal and something worthy of Hobhammer.
It was a good idea. I just spotted it in the comments.
Like, it's a very respectable way to try and climb the ladder, because if you could pull it off, then clearly you were paying attention and taking advantage of things that your opponent should have been aware of. It's not like, oh my god, someone did this great betrayal. It's, oh, that guy fucked up, not covering his bases. But the idea that they have managed to stay unified for such a long time really and truly speaks to an actual culture. You know, if you go back to our Black Crag episode, one of the things we talk about is that the thing that's so fun about Black Crag is it indicates the idea that there is a genuine culture that some greenskins participate in, but it's rare. Whereas for the Hobgoblins, it seems to be the default.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to go slightly further in this before my headphones run out of battery because I hear them pinging in my ears. I've got a wire. I'll be fine. And that's that Hobgoblins, for me, are quite clearly unlike other greenskins in a variety of ways. Now, we could just bring it down to their core psychology being different in that they are more prone to thinking of consequences and what lies ahead, that treachery is hard-coded into their very being. But all of that combines to create what is clearly a culture. And it is a culture that has developed over a long period of time, and all of the Hobgoblins participate in. They are far more like humans in comparison to how they're described and how they have built over time than any other greenskin society, which is either A, been subjugated and become something else, Noblars, or alternatively runs by the standard greenskin mob up, wah, fall apart, mob up, and wah cycle of culture. Now, to be blunt, all greenskins have cultures of various types, but as we are human, it's very easy to ascribe culture to something that is similar to us. And in this regard, the culture that the Hobgoblins show is the most cultural, and that is the most human-like. And that is why, if I was, for example, trying to pin down where something like half-orcs come from, it most certainly would make most sense to have it come from the most human-like of the greenskins, or at least have come from somewhere that's similar to that, because it sort of makes sense. The good old Hobgoblin Khanate is a particularly human construction in comparison to all of the greenskin equivalents, which just aren't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which will probably make for a good segue, especially kind of looking at the time, of getting into a little bit of heretical theory crafting.
Heretical theory craft time. I do like heretical theory craft time.
Yeah, of kind of looking and supposing, like looking at all the uniqueness of the Hobgoblins. The fact that they have this bizarre evolutionary trait where they have a literal, their back plates have fused together to make it harder to backstab them. And they have this very distinct, fascinating relationship. And looking at that and going, what if someone actually thought about this for more than 5 seconds and just was like, that's just the way they are, whatever, moving on.
Yeah, quite. So I definitely think there's a lot to consider here. Because what we have are greenskins that are hated by other greenskins. Point the first. Second, greenskins that are evolutionarily completely different to other greenskins. Point the second. The fact that the Greenskins arrived only approximately, just to put a round number on it, 10,000 years ago, not enough time for evolution. Point the third. These hobgoblins are unique and exciting and interesting and different. That being the case, we immediately have to ask why. In Warhammer, there is always two reasons why. In fact, there's really only one: magic. And ultimately, magic in Warhammer comes from chaos, but it's not only used by chaos. In the case of the Black Orcs, they were created using a scientific stroke magical process created by the Chaos Dwarves, and they made Black Orcs, an attempt to create greenskins that were loyal and capable and much more easy to control. God, did they fuck up in so many ways. And the Hobgoblins are equally a different type of greenskin, in this case, one that is fundamentally different to the rest. And if they are supposedly everything they're described as, they have to have been created. The question is, by whom? And there are very few options available. Option number one is chaos. It's an odd one, and I'm sure you could build a story for it, but there's not an obvious story. You'd have to sit down and go, why the heck would this have come about? We have lots of opportunities as to when it could have occurred. For example, at the dawn of the world, when the Great War against Chaos, the very first one happened, the Cataclysm, we had ourselves an entire realm of chaos up in the north, where thousands of demon princes had sworn to Be'lakor. Be'lakor had risen as a material god up there. The idea that he might have fucked with the greenskins is not beyond any story at all. That's certainly something that could have occurred. Changing them into something that more suited your goals, and treachery is at the very heart of, for example, Be'lakor. So could you have someone like Be'lakor taking the greenskins and trying to create something that defended against his southern border, against other greenskins, against the dragons, getting something that bound up and was effectively treacherous at its core? It all works. And we can build a good story out of this. Be'lakor is one option of where they could have come from. And you could get a relatively good story. I could build a story for most of Chaos with this, but Be'lakor is the obvious choice because we have ourselves what is at that point a god in the material realm, in the right place, with the right amount of power, surrounded by thousands of demons who all pretty much have sworn to him, and they're all of the power of demon princes. They are more than capable of building something like this. The second option, and again, it's heretical, but not exactly beyond concept, is the obvious one, the old ones. The old ones clearly just before the Cataclysm, or arguably during the Cataclysm, depending on which story you go with, grow increasingly more desperate to hold off what's coming. And the greenskins are clearly rising across the world regardless. Or if you're just using pure foresight, they're going to rise across the world, and it's going to be awful. The Hobgoblins can stand against that, basically stand the tide against the tide. And you build yourself an entire species that uses the greenskin advantages against them, can bind greenskins together underneath their banner in a way that the greenskins do not like. They view that as pure treachery. And we have evidence that greenskins are doing this, and that Hobgoblins are doing this. The only character we have with any real description literally has bound greenskins under his banner, doing quite ungreenskinny things, working together with humans and others underneath a fixed banner. So we have ourselves a real potential answer for old ones being the source, and that they gave them effectively culture. They gave them the ability to think beyond the standard, I just react with what's directly in front of me. And now all orcs, if they get old enough, can reach that point eventually, so it's not beyond their thought processes. And they just made a new version of orc for whatever weird purposes the old ones have. Now, I could spin long stories about how this could work. They're completely pointless in doing so, because it's not really the answer, because there is no answer. But it's definitely a potential answer. This one, however, is more controversial. And that's that during the Cataclysm, everything went tits up, as we know. And during that tits up process, the orcs themselves almost certainly would have been, contrary to what most of the stories say, potentially in ascendancy. Demons are popping up everywhere, and as we all know, the more you hit an orc, the bigger it gets. The more an orc goes to the war, like the Incredible Hulk itself, the bigger and nastier and meaner it gets. The orc warlords that will have been building up during the course of the Cataclysm would have been terrifying, and they would have to have been held back. Now, if Chaos weren't holding them back, who was? I think we're in a position where, at the height of magic, someone like the elves could have made them. Now, this is beyond controversy
That's
because
very spicy, very spicy.
because the elven gods exist at this point. They absolutely exist. These are entities of extraordinary power. And the idea that the elves went in potentially on the divine level and said, these need to be remade to ensure that the greenskins do not overthrow what we hold as important. It's not just the sort of things that elves would do. 100% the arrogant view that they have of the world, that they can just reshape it to their will. Particularly if, for example, the dragons are causing them issues or something else. They're not allying or whatever story you wish to make. Having the hobgoblins come from a divine source, in this particular case, an elven source, completely makes sense. In fact, I would argue makes more sense than some of the other options, because what we have here is a manipulation quite clearly of the standard greenskin genome. And whilst that is Old Ones standard, there is also all the stories of the Old Ones not wanting them to be there at all. And it just feels a better fix to have it post Old One so that we're not telling the same story again and again and again. What you're looking to do is to try and tell different stories, spin it in slightly different ways. So there's a clear force that we could do. And we could use exactly the same force with the dragons. So the elves on one side, dragons on the other. We have ourselves... Now, the dragons at this point... Oh, yeah, do you want to
go? So the only thing I just want to throw in is that I like what you're putting down. I also think that the dragons could make an interesting angle of, like, you know, we know what the big sin of Dad is, creating the Great Maw. But, like, what if that was Mom's great sin, using yin magic, trying to influence greenskins, and hobgoblins are the result?
Yeah. And I think, generally speaking, we have ourselves lots of untold stories in the East. And there is some pretty obvious roots towards some almost fable-like stories, myths that come from the past. And I think that the hobgoblins being created from the greenskins is an obvious place that we need myths tied into. So my next step was into the dragons. Now, the dragons make an obvious choice as well, because they have the power, they have the capability, they have the arrogance of thinking that they can just turn the greenskins to their own whim and throw them into the north to hold off chaos. In many respects, you can even see them being used as a tool to hold chaos in the north, but that goes wrong. They form their own thing. They're designed to be mobile. They're designed to effectively make use of the strengths of chaos against them, so they can harry them and constantly, by their very genome, the way their genes work, run away. But they're treacherous and it all goes wrong. They end up warring against Cathay at a later date. That would also work. But if I was doing it now, I would look at all of those and I would write myths for all of those as being potentials, because in the end, Warhammer works at its best, but it's not necessarily clear. And I would probably rethink it entirely and go, what's going to work best for there? And I would try to make it something Eastern, because I have no desire to make it another elf thing, personally, nor do I have any desire to make it another Old One thing. But there are many people who knew what the Old Ones did and possibly even knew how the Old Ones did it, especially when they come from that era. So I would be looking at a power in the East doing this, possibly to stymie chaos, possibly to stymie Cathay, possibly to stymie something else, but definitely an Eastern power. But if I were to lay it down as just one thing, they are definitely a creation, because in my world, the greenskins are the same as 40k greenskins, and hobgoblins don't fit into that at all. So my question is, how do they fit? And my answer would be, they have been manipulated by something during the cataclysm, and they created this great greenskin species that other greenskins despise because they're just not orky. They're just not right. They have been built, and these creatures by their nature are deeply treacherous, and unlike greenskins, do not band together with Wa. So they are fundamentally, to a degree, broken from Mork and Gork, but can still utilize Mork and Gork in a way that really upsets greenskins. And what upsets them even more is that once a hobgoblin's in command, they kind of follow the orders for one reason or another. So I would definitely be tying that into why they were created, what they did, and how it manifested.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun things that could be done with that. I mean, even going, if someone wanted to, you could even go so far as like introducing a race that did that, mess with greenskins, created the hobgoblins, and then got destroyed by them. And there's just leftovers of ruins of some great nation that maybe was on like that Korean peninsula over there, and they're just gone. Because they got wiped out from messing with forces they didn't understand.
Or just haven't been detailed yet.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of fun things you can do with that. I do want to pick up a couple comments that I saw that were kind of interesting. So Gravy the Red, kind of talking about like the feeding the wolves thing again, says that when it comes to the herds to feed the wolves in themselves, maybe they have herds of some kinds of creatures that their empires follow or have alongside them, which I will say, like, one of the things that's really fun with the Hobgoblin Khanate is there's enough there that you can kind of visualize what they would look like on a table or in Total War Warhammer, but there's also enough empty space that you can fantasize over what else would there be. Like the idea of these great herding. I mean, think how big a lot of herding creatures are in the world, of like the idea of them, think about like, bison and, how large they are when they were being followed around the Americas. And like, what could the Hobgoblin Khans be chasing after? Like, if that's a part of why they're so mobile, is the things that they hunt, and could be a part of their armies. These great horrible beasties that are maybe not, kind of like when you think about a stegodon, their preference maybe isn't to eat people, but in the Warhammer world, when there's protein, as the saying goes, which is actually just how real life is too, which is horrifying when you see it unexpectedly.
Yeah, I think there's almost certainly going to be a herding aspect. I imagine there's going to be a lot of horses that they herd and move along with. Horses are relatively swift moving as well, because you don't need to just rely on giant versions of real world creatures. Let's transport it over. But I also think that they're going to have equivalents of that. Mammoths are a very real thing up there. So there's going to be some form of hunting of those. They're going to be hunted rather than followed. There's going to be other large entities up there that they're going to be feeding, not just to themselves, but to their wolves. So yeah, hunting makes absolute sense.
Yeah, Dunamans. You know how some lions hunt elephants? I've just imagined these horse-sized wolves hunting mammoths. Yeah, or hell, I mean, even if you're keeping it around wolves, you ever seen like how a pack of wolves takes down a moose? It is a thing. Yeah, like it is absolutely a whole fucking thing to take down a moose. Those things are horrifyingly huge.
Yeah.
Some other just kind of like random things that I read earlier in the day, and I for some reason have not thought about how to insert them into the stream up to this point, but I think are interesting. Another thing about the Hobgoblins I read about that I loved, and is once again something that showcases a unique relationship and difference between like regular Goblin Wolf Riders and Hobgoblin Wolf Riders. Is that so when you're dealing with Goblin Wolf Riders, they typically don't use much of the way of tactics. And if they do use tactics, they're very, very simple. Like something along the lines of they'll run around for an exposed flank, shoot at them, maybe charge in, and they'll run away if things look a little hot. Or they might, bait a charge. Well, they'll make themselves look a little weak, like they're running away, so people will break rank to chase them, and then they turn around and charge back. Like, that's fairly standard fare for both goblins and hobgoblins. But where hobgoblins get super fucking cool is there's a couple of mentions of one of their fighting tactics, three of them that I found super interesting. And these are all based on real world tactics that are quite fun. The first being that the hobgoblins are very good at using what I'll just kind of vaguely refer to as size manipulation, of the sense of deliberately kicking up lots of dust to make using approaches to make it seem like there's more of them than there actually is, while also simultaneously using stealth and deliberately sending out small parties to make themselves appear smaller than they are, to try and manipulate their enemies into doing certain things, to react in certain ways. But my favorite is there's a talk from a Chilean general about a tactic that the hobgoblin use, where they ride in a column, and the hobgoblins at the front of the column shoot arrows, and then immediately after they shoot, they fall back around the sides, and the next rank shoot their arrows. And they do that, and as the front rank gets back to the front, they have had exactly enough time to reload and pull back so they can fire another volley. So it's this never-ending volley fire of arrows into your face as they're running at or by you, which is a horrible strategy to go up against, because they just wear you down like a bitch.
And classic hobgoblin tactic, which is not to engage directly, it's to only charge in the flank or the rear, to always shoot from the front, to never effectively the cowardly aspect of them that's hard driven into their coding is right there. As an easy way of thinking of orcs and goblins, and I fully understand this is a very almost gamey way of thinking about it, but the more orcs and goblins there is, you generally find the better they think. Now, this may sound vaguely controversial, but if you've just got a few orcs and goblins working on a scout party, some equivalent, they tend to be idiots. Their tactics are rubbish. They're not very good. Small tribes tend to be mostly stupid. But then you get them together into several tribes, and they're all working together. The best one amongst them rises up. And you tend to find that they're vaguely intelligent. Their tactics get a bit better. And then you get the whole WA going on, and you tend to find the one that's at the head of the WA is often pretty clever. Not just having conversations about tactics, but getting down with it. The focus of all of that orky energy turns into proper intellect. The hobgoblins seem to have that as standard. And that is one of the core differences between them as greenskins and the rest. The other greenskins appear to be, broadly speaking, pretty rubbish until you get lots of them. But the hobgoblins appear to be all relatively individual. Each and every one of them is capable of the sneaky stabbing that they're known for from the beginning. Each one of them capable of reflective thought, tactics, thinking, doing what's best for the overall group and not just as the individual. They are quite different to other greenskins, and which is why I said they're a little bit more human. They have the same reflexive capability as humans. That's one of the reasons why it's so very easy to say, oh, the old ones made them. Because all of the old one species are built around that model, that ability for deep capacity of thought. A lot of Heish and a lot of Shaman, to use the winds of magic, run into their creation. Unlike most greenskins, which tend to only get this when there's a lot of them, it's all focused in on one point, and that one individual epitomizes and controls the rest. They're more like a hive species than individuals, which is an interesting way of viewing them, but is broadly accurate. And you tend to find that the orcs who have led Great Wars are the ones who tend to be the biggest, cleverest, bestest, and may eventually settle down, like, for example, what happens down in the Black Crag. So we have lots of different ways to view greenskins, but the hobgoblins keep on bucking the trend. And they keep on doing something a bit different because ultimately their creation is not founded in the spore model because they were made before that. They were created all the way back in first edition Warhammer and copy pasted down through the editions. And they never, ever had the spore model in mind when they were made. So no one sat down and went, how are we going to make them like the rest of the greenskins as they were presented in the fourth edition of Warhammer and reiterated through fifth, sixth, seventh, or whatever? No one did that. So the hobgoblins have always been a bit different. And then as we approach them afterwards, we're left with why? And the answer in Warhammer isn't hard to find. And that's because they're different. I know it sounds obvious, but that's it. They're just different. They're not like other greenskins. And that then opens up that beautiful question. Well, why? And for me, when it comes to hobgoblins, that's ultimately everything that I would love to answer or have answered. Just sit down, have a good hobnob, and build a really good story for how we hobnob our hobgobs into place. And for me, I have an answer for my current game. I already decided this right at the very beginning where the hobgoblins had come from because it was a core component to some of the world building I was doing for my current Lawhammer game. Has it popped up in our game? Hell no, because we're nowhere near that. But it's a component of our game. For your games, you can make your own answers. During the course of this stream, we've given a whole bunch of different options. For example, the old ones did it. Elves did it. Someone over in the east did it. They did it to themselves. An individual orc or goblin was different. The rise of the half-orcs, we can then discuss exactly where they come from if you wish to do so. There's all manner of cool stories that could be told. But if you are building it yourself, there does appear to be one consistency in all of it. And that's that magic is almost certainly involved because the Warhammer world is saturated with it in a way that makes 40k look mundane. The number of magic users on the Warhammer world in comparison to this average psyker in 40k, it's ridiculous. You know, in 40k, they're like, oh, 1 in 1 million is such and such a power. Like every fourth fellow in Warhammer world is weird and magical and a bit odd because there's so much magic saturated into everything that the Warhammer world is. And these hobgoblins are really close to all of that.
Yeah, to be fair to 40k, Warhammer is basically like half Eye of Terror. So
it's a proper mess. And the hobgoblins are in the north, saturated with this mess. So there is 1,000 different options for how we could build them. But if there's anyone out there who is future leaning towards creating these themselves. Perhaps you've been hired by Games Workshop or something similar, and you happen on this. I can only say, don't make them like the rest of the greenskins, because why? They're just not.
Yeah, be spicy.
Yeah, be spicy.
Dumb-Man, you could have a really interesting conversation between the Khanate Hobgoblin mercenaries and the slave Hobgoblins, especially Gorda's backstabber trying to order these mercenaries around them, having disdain for him as a fake Khan. Oh, yeah,
I think that would be the case. Definitely.
Yeah,
100% Dynamite.
Yeah, there would be some big, not fun conversations between those groups. They would hate each other a lot.
Yeah, I think the freedom that is held by these the true Khanate Hobgoblins in comparison, the steppe Hobgoblins in comparison to those who are slaves, who call themselves Khans, these little kings who believe themselves self-important but are nothing more than slaves themselves. Oh yeah, there's going to be some real disgruntlement going on between those factions. Animosity will be rising, because one thing that's been consistent from Hobgoblins from the beginning is that they still have greenskin animosity. And that animosity should absolutely manifest.
Yeah. The last thing I think I'll talk about a little bit is that if you want to read some fun Hobgoblin stuff from an unexpected place, there actually are some fun mentions about Hobgoblin. It's from kind of a mythical point of view, or like a rumor point of view, as opposed to like just fact. But if you read the Scarsnick novel, there's a good portion of the book where Scarsnick leaves Karragate Peaks early on in his life, and he basically goes to the Wolflands and he hangs out with the wolf tribes. And one of the things that's talked about in the book is that the wolf tribes kind of emulate the Hobgoblin tribes to a much less successful degree. But one of the things they talk about that I love, and I will kill to have if we ever get them in Total War or on the tabletop, is that the Hobgoblins are said to have these grand moving cities where, like, they have what would appear on the horizon to be a city, like tall structures made of either wood or bone or leather and all these different things that are just pulled by these great gatherings of wolves. And they're these huge platforms that have like bolt throwers on them that can like kind of rotate a little bit to hunt the great beasts of the steppes. And that their entire, it's a full, like, we're talking thousands of Hobgoblins, like having a quote unquote livable city, but it's on the move constantly, which would make for such a kick-ass like monster model. It's like, oh, the Empire's got their steam tanks, the Dwarfs got their fucking thunder barges, the Hobgoblins got their movable city bolt thrower platform with like archer towers.
So I love that. And one thing that Warhammer does very well frequently is take an idea and then dial it up to 11. Spinal tapping their way to something that is actually ridiculous, but is so super cool. To go back to that controversial world design comment I mentioned about halfway through this stream, sometimes you don't care about what works and you care about what's cool. And that is that is 100% a core component of Warhammer world building. The roleplay writers have to then come in afterwards and go, how can I make this cool thing work? But when you're building the first concepts, often what's real is out the window and what's fucking awesome comes in. And some mortal engine craziness, divine hobgoblin nonsense getting pooped around from one place to the next. Hobgoblin shamans having the ability to make their the things pulling it or some equivalent do it so much faster so that their cities can just disappear as if they were never there in the first place, like a mirage that was sitting on the horizon of the steppe. That's lovely. Okay, the idea that they've got all manner of spells to cover their movements so that they can come in swiftly as all the wolf riders come flying out from the side of their great pens that are literally on the move themselves. There's all manner of cool shit, the equivalent of a land-bound Black Ark of Nagaroth. With hobgoblins spilling out of it. It's horrific, it's awful, and it's also super cool. And something that the Skaven would have infiltrated in a different way as they take up parts within this great moving city. I love that also. Making a Warhammer equivalent that in no way resembles the real world equivalent, takes everything the real world offers as inspiration for ideas, but not copy-paste for the cultures. Something that's unique and just freaking awesome would be great. And if you are developing the hobgoblins in their own unique way, this, I think, is definitely a cool place where you could begin, because I quite like it.
Yeah, Adam makes a really interesting comment here that I like a lot. Interesting concept could be, if the hobgoblins were truly manipulated by someone else in ancient times, what if the Chaos Wars figured that out and used it as a basis to try and manipulate the orcs, which led to the Black Orcs?
So, Adam, I don't just think that's a good idea. That's the idea I would take. In that, I would have the Hobgoblins and the Chaos Dwarves tearing them apart with their magic, eviscerating them, finding out how they work. Their more scientific minds pulling it apart and realizing they're not normal. Something's been done to them, and then trying to figure out how that worked, and then doing the same to orcs and royally fucking it up.
And realizing too late, there's a reason the first group chose goblins.
Quite. Or possibly made them thinner. Or possibly the first group actually succeeded and the Black Orcs are a failure. Black Orcs are really what you don't want to do. And ultimately, you could argue that perhaps that decision is what brings about the end of the world as the Black Orcs wander around kicking living crap and wiping out all the potential benefits that the East could have brought to the end game come the end times. Yeah, there's all sorts of arguments one could make, but I think, Adam, definitely I would go down that route.
Joe Miller, perhaps half-orc could instead be a moniker instead of literal for greenskins that act more human than green. Hobbs empire building, mercenaries that follow orders, etc.
Indeed. So, Joe Miller, you've hit upon the answer that I think is the best, which is half-orcs are hobgoblins.
Yeah, that'd be like a fun way to explain Ruglugs armored orcs. That regiment renown.
Half-orcs are literally hobgoblins. In that humans have met them and thought they were half-orcs and thought they were a mixture between, because they just, out of ignorance, refer to them as, well, they're half-orcs, aren't they? So in my world, that's a perfect answer for a difficult position. And that's that we have a species that's far more human that looks like orcs. They're half-orcs, aren't they? Yeah. They live beside humans, yeah. They're just half human, aren't they? Yeah. I mean, nobody knows. I mean, you've got to remember that if we go back just a few hundred years, people didn't even understand where real humans came from. They didn't understand the concept of semen and impregnating eggs and doing all that business. Many people have thought that, having sex had nothing to do with having babies because ignorance spread. Now, obviously, there was the intelligentsia who were more aware of these things, but normal people spreading their normal stuff, many just didn't understand how stuff worked. And often we make the mistake when we're writers or creators of assuming that the people in the world that you're creating understand how stuff works in a way that modern people do. They simply don't. So having people just get it wrong, having people being deeply ignorant is a core component of building a world like Warhammer. And having things like half-orcs just be a mistake is not just, I think, acceptable. I think it's a good way of understanding hobgoblins within the greater world. If you came from, for example, the Empire, there are no hobgoblins there. There might be some down in Tilia, whatever, but there are none there. They see them and they go, well, they look more human. What are these They've got half-orcs. What the? How's this a thing? The humans and orcs living together and vaguely working together. They go down to Tilia, see some half-orcs working with humans and other orcs.
That's such an easy, good segue too. Of you have that classic nation versus nations racism. Of I hear the Chileans sleep with orcs.
Sleep with them. Yeah, look, with orcs. One of their greatest generals, a half orc. He calls himself Gazak. Gazak Khan, the half orc. Yeah, you can totally see that. That makes sense to me.
Hey, again, what if the Hobbs were created to infiltrate the greenskin system and cause problems by the old ones and something went wrong? I mean, that's an angle you could take. That they were
100% Hagen, like that. Yeah, like that a lot.
Lindsay, Lorebeards was off last week, but I couldn't say it then. But Andy and I have been together for 29 years last week, and is even more knowledgeable about Warhammer. And he's even more knowledgeable about Warhammer than he was then, and I'm totally here for it.
Okay, so I don't want to call her out live in line, but it's actually 10 days before our anniversary. So our anniversary is on the 27th of November. Our first going out together. Nice try, Lindsay.
My bad. I shouldn't have brought it up. My bad.
I'm only doing that so she can shout at me afterwards.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lindsay.
Well, to get some revenge for her,
29
I did.
Years. Is it seriously 29 years? Oh, man. It's going to be 30 years next year. Wow.
To get a little revenge for Andy, I did have to message her before the stream being like, is Andy alive? Is he okay? Where is he?
As we opened with the stream, I was alive. I wasn't as okay as I could have been. But hey, I survived the whole stream. I'm calling that a victory.
Yeah, I would say so too. The bowels, the defenses remain strong.
Quite.
Dinoman, humans and orcs living together, mass hysteria. I mean, to be fair, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Dinoman, that's the point. And I could easily see that's where the rumors of half orcs come from.
Yep. But with that, we're pretty much at our time.
We are. That was a good one. Thanks, all. Lots of good, really good questions in that one. And thanks so much for super chatting them and bringing them up. I have a few things to end on. Number one, if you haven't bought Dark Deeds yet, you should. It's coming up to Christmas. It's a perfect board game.
Second copy just arrived.
You just bought a second copy? Superb. I was very amused to note that even both my daughters have bought their own copy, so you should as well. If you want to know more about it, we actually played the game live during Lawhammer a couple of weeks back. And that was super fun. You can watch that right now if you want to do so over on the Lawhammering channels. It's called a tricky treat because we did it for our Halloween episode. And you don't really need to be watching Lawhammer to watch it, although do be aware we're playing it in character. So that's definitely a thing. We played the game in character because we made it part of our Warhammer world. So that's quite fun. So do pre-order, whatever else, order that yourself. It may not come into stores because those stores need to try and get it from Modiphius, but you can definitely buy it from Modiphius direct. So I would suggest doing so. Other than that, we will be back next week with something because we've not decided yet. We're going to discuss it after the stream.
Yeah, so the big things will be that there will be a poll on my channel after the stream. We also, unless something comes up, which might, but hopefully won't, we will be doing the Skaven
eventually.
Yeah, eventually. We're hoping to do the Council of 13 Skaven tier list this Wednesday.
Oh yeah,
so that should be fun. And at the end of that stream, we'll do another poll so we can get back to being like a week in advance.
Yeah, totally. So be aware that's this Wednesday. We'll probably be starting at 10 p.m. UK time. Translate that to your own times using the internet. So, yeah.
Also, just to fuck up everything I just said a little bit, I don't know exactly if we'll do it on a makeup day, but we will not be having Lorebeards at the normal time next week because I am being sacrificed to a family function.
Family functions.
So, so we will let you know what is going to be on for that. We'll figure that out.
Superb. So without any further ado, I shall simply say thank you very much for turning up. I hope you enjoyed what we discussed about Hobgoblins and didn't find our discussion too controversial, where we suggested that Hobgoblins are not like normal greenskins at all, and in fact may have been created by an external party like the old ones, elves, dragons, or possibly an unknown entity in the east.
It's not Lorebeards if we don't get one angry comment.
Exactly. We've got to get one crazy thing, don't we?
See you guys later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.